Hello everyone, very good afternoon and welcome back to Byju's Exam Prep. So welcome back to our discussion on internal security. In the morning, we were discussing about terrorism. We spoke about Jammu and Kashmir. We covered pan-India terrorism and how India has adopted a new counter-terror architecture after the Mumbai attacks. Now let us talk about the legal framework that India has created to fight terrorism in the country. We studied NIA. We understood the role of NIA, the powers of NIA by looking at the NIA Act. We also understood the proposal to create NCTC, why it was opposed, right? So now let's talk about the legal framework we have in India to counter terrorism. I've told you from the very first class that UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967, is the primary anti-terror law that we have in the country today. Apart from UAPA, there have been few other legislations. Even today we have few other laws as well, which are used in cases of terrorism. This includes the National Security Act of 1980. It is still in place. It is still being used, especially by the state police. Previously, we had two laws called TADA and POTA. These two laws were specifically brought in to deal with terrorism, but both became very controversial and both have been removed from the law books. TADA and POTA, they don't exist anymore. So we need to understand this legal framework. We have to understand how the law defines terrorism, what kind of provisions are present under it, why TADA, POTA became controversial, what's the problem with these laws, and what is the criticism related to UAPA and National Security Act. Let's take a look at this for a few minutes, because here as well I expect a mains question to be asked. UPSC can easily ask a 10-mark question on this. UPSC might ask you to evaluate the anti-terror laws in the country. It might ask you to critically examine the anti-terror legislation in the country. So without knowing these basic facts and the analysis around it, you won't be able to answer those questions. So let's take a look at TADA and POTA first. Let's understand why these laws were introduced, why they became controversial, and why they were removed. Then we will talk briefly about UAPA and National Security Act. The TADA was enacted in 1987, primarily to counter the Khalistan movement. This is something I had mentioned last weekend as well when we discussed the Khalistan movement. It was a stringent law that was introduced by the then Rajiv Gandhi government to help our police forces to fight against terrorism. So TADA stands for Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act. This law was specifically designed to counter terrorism. It gave a definition of terrorism. It defined the offenses and the punishments. And it also defined the powers of the police. The detention powers, the powers to arrest, the powers to collect evidence, right? The provision of bail, all these provisions were dealt with by this law called TADA. But the problem with TADA was that it was a very, very stringent law. It was designed to favor the police and security forces without balancing the interests of the accused. Any law in a democratic country should have a fine balance. Yes, protecting national security is important. Enforcing the law is important. But at the same time, you cannot provide for laws which can be misused by your police, which can lead to human rights violations. That is exactly what happened with TADA. Once you are booked under TADA, bail would become impossible. So the accused, let's say they are innocent. In a democratic setup, principles of natural justice says that you are innocent until proven guilty. Even in a case of terrorism, the accused is presumed to be innocent by the courts. The responsibility is on the state. It's on the police to prove their guilt. For that, they have to conduct thorough investigation, collect evidence to show that this is the person involved in the attack. But here in Tada, what happened was the police were given enormous powers. Stringent powers were given, and the definitions were very broad and vague, which gave lot of discretion to the police authorities to interpret. Maximum detention powers were given. They could detain the suspects for longer periods in custody. They could easily obtain warrants for search, for collecting evidence. So these tremendous powers that were given to the police ended up being misused by the police authorities. They blatantly misused the provisions. Many innocents were also charged under Tada, and for many years they have suffered, and this is nothing but injustice done by the state. On the other hand, the actual terrorists were not even held and punished properly in many cases. So many such cases came up where there was a complete miscarriage of justice. Many incidents were reported where custodial torture was being committed, the suspects were being kidnapped, there were custodial deaths as well under cases related to Tada. So this gave rise to allegations that the provisions of the law was enabling human right violations in the name of fighting terrorism. See, both are extremes. On one hand, yes, we have to fight terrorism. At the same time, fundamental rights and human rights have to be protected. That is an obligation of any constitutional state. You cannot have biased laws or such stringent provisions which are not well defined, which gives a lot of discretion to the authorities to interpret, because that will always result in violation of the law, abuse of the law, where innocents will get targeted. Even if he or she is an accused, even if they have been involved in some kind of terrorist activity, they deserve a fair treatment in the judicial system, in the criminal system. But under laws like Tada, there was blatant violations committed, from tortures to custodial death, to unnecessary arrests, detentions, denial of bail, and eventually these cases would fall apart in the court. So what does it mean? It means that to begin with, many of the cases were false. Since the state police would be eager to get results, there would be political pressure on them. Since they were incapable to investigate the case properly and arrest the actual terrorists, they would go behind others who were barely connected to the attack. They would go behind innocents and put up the charges against them. In many cases, they would torture the suspects and obtain confessions from them. Confessions by themselves are not admissible as evidence in a court of law. But by obtaining confessions, they would extend their custody, keep them in jail for months and years. And finally, when the case comes to court for prosecution, the courts would throw the cases out. They would dismiss them due to lack of evidence. So either it was incapability of our police forces to get the evidence, or to begin with, the case was false. These were innocents who were framed by the police. So this was being allowed under Tada. In a way, Tada was encouraging such practices across the country, so it became very, very controversial. Luckily, the law had a sunset clause. When it was enacted, it had a sunset clause. You would know what is a sunset clause if you have studied polity. Basically, it's an expiry date. When it was enacted, it was already provided with an expiry date that the law would lapse in 10 years if it is not extended. It was initially proposed in 1985. So from then, the law would apply till 1995 for 1 decade. And if the parliament doesn't extend the law again, the law will automatically lapse. So because of all the controversy surrounding Tada, the parliament allowed the law to lapse in 1995. The Bombay blast case was dealt with under Tada. That's where Tada became even more controversial, including the Sanjay Dutt case, where Sanjay Dutt was arrested with arms related to the Bombay blast. Right? He was charged under TADA, even though he himself was not involved in the terror attack. He had only received a consignment of those weapons. But Sanjay Dutt was tried under the stringent provisions of TADA. So that made the law even more controversial. So following a lot of controversies, allegations of human right violations and fundamental right violations, finally the government and the parliament allowed the law to lapse in 1995. They did not renew it. This is how TADA went away from the law books. Is that clear? So after this, we again didn't have a law against terrorism. There was no specific law dealing with terrorism. So the Vajpayee government, which came into power later, introduced the POTA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, was enacted by the Vajpayee government. The parliament enacted the law in 2002. This was a repeat of TADA, basically. Even though it had new provisions, it was a new law entirely. The same problems were repeated. The same mistakes were repeated under POTA. Very stringent powers were given. Enormous powers were given to police and law enforcement agencies. Bail would be denied. Once you're charged under POTA, bail was impossible. Basically, the fundamental right and human right aspect was ignored again. Broad and vague definitions were given for terrorism and the offenses related to it, leading to misuse of the law again. The same controversy broke out and erupted, and finally it was repealed by the next government, by the Manmohan Singh government, which came into power in 2004. POTA also attracted a lot of controversy on similar lines, on exactly the same lines. And as a result, POTA was repealed by the parliament in 2004. So basically, in 2004, when India was suffering from multiple acts of terrorism, we did not have a dedicated law to fight terrorism. The previous laws were problematic. They were creating more problems, new problems, instead of helping us solve the terrorist problem. The only two laws which remain today is the National Security Act, which is invoked in cases of terror activities. But the primary law against terrorism is UAPA. Now let me tell you the story of UAPA here. UAPA was never meant to fight terrorism. It's a very old law passed in 1967. Is that clear? Let me explain why this law was introduced. It was introduced to deal with any kind of unlawful activity which was a threat to national integration. Because in 1960s, India had fought two wars. The 1962 war with China, 1965 war with Pakistan. When India was fighting these external conflicts, there were some internal disturbances in the country. There were some internal security issues in the country. So for the government, it had become challenging to deal with external wars while dealing with a domestic security crisis. These unlawful events happening inside India were seen as a threat to national integration. Because when the country is fighting an external war, we want the country to be united. We want the whole country to be united to fight the external enemy. But internally, there were security situations developing. So that is why in 1967, a law was introduced to promote national integration, to give special powers to the government, that is to the police and the security agencies, to ensure that unlawful activities can be tackled. Now, what are these unlawful activities? It essentially defined some anti-national activities. Activities that threaten the security of the state, activities that directly challenge the state. Such provisions were included under this law. It never dealt with terrorism. In fact, in 1960s, modern day terrorism against India that we have today didn't even exist. The problem of terrorism came up much later for India. In 1967, we were only dealing with some insurgencies in Northeast India, and then the Naxal movement had just started. So when the law was introduced, we did not have the current problem of terrorism. It doesn't even have the provision to define terrorism. So this law was reactivated in 2004. The Manmohan Singh government, which had repealed POTA, which was previously passed by the Vajpayee government, right? This law was repealed by the new government. And since India didn't have any anti-terror law, they took this old law, the UAPA, got it amended. And this is how it turned into our primary anti-terror law. Provisions related to terrorism were added through an amendment. This is where the problem lies with UAPA. Because the law, when it was introduced in 1967, it was never meant for terrorism. It was meant for a set of anti-national activities which were considered as unlawful, which were considered as a threat to the security of the state and the national integration of the country. This old, outdated law was revived through amendments done in 2004, 2008, after the Mumbai attacks, 2012, and more recently in 2019. Through these four amendments, UAPA has been turned into the primary anti-terror law today. So, through the amendment, the definition of terrorism has been provided. Terror activities are defined. Any kind of support to terrorist activities is also covered under the law. Let's say some people have given funds to a terrorist organization, or some Indians have given logistical support to terrorists. They have sheltered them, supplied weapons to them, or they have concealed terrorists in their homes. Any kind of support given to terrorists also gets covered under the law. So it's not just terrorism and acts of the terrorists, but even those supporting them, even that is covered under UAPA. All right? Terror financing is covered. We have implemented FATF standards against terrorism through the 2012 amendment. Because every country has an obligation to implement Financial Action Task Force standards to counter money laundering and terrorist financing. So we have adopted the FATF standards to fight terrorist financing by amending UAPA. Terror financing measures are included here itself. Whereas to fight money laundering, we have a separate law, the PMLA, Prevention of Money Laundering Act. So PMLA also has been amended again and again to match our law with FATF standards. We will study PMLA under money laundering chapter. Don't worry, we'll come to it tomorrow. But to deal with terror financing and to adopt FATF standards, the law was amended and the anti-terror financing measures were also added in order to counter terrorist financing. So through the 2004, 2008, 2012 amendments, all these provisions were added one by one. Today, UAPA also deals with membership of any terror group. If you have any radical material in your possession, even this is covered under the law as evidence. All right? So all such provisions related to terrorism and terror-related activities are added with very stringent provisions and punishments. Under UAPA, bail becomes impossible. There is extended custody, extended periods of detention provided to the police and the law enforcement agencies to enable their investigation. So the government feels that these measures are necessary. These strict measures are needed to fight terrorism. But however, UAPA also has generated very similar controversies. The problem here is that one, it is an outdated law. It was never meant to fight terrorism. We just took the old law and refurbished this into an anti-terror law. Just by adding some provisions that defined terrorism, terror activities, support to terrorism, and other provisions, we turned this into an anti-terror law. So there is a problem with the very spirit of the law. Here as well, there is lot of discretion given to the police and the NIA. The police and law enforcement agencies which enforce UAPA, they have a lot of discretion, which is often getting misused. Let me give you an example to justify this argument. Now, how will law enforcement agencies prove the membership of an organization? It's not that a terror group will issue member cards or ID cards saying that this guy is a member of our terrorist group. It's not that they will officially acknowledge that these are members of our organization, right? This has to be done through investigation. The police, law enforcement have to investigate, collect evidence to show that this terrorist, accused terrorist, was part of the terror group. But here, since membership itself is punishable, usually what happens is that the police can accuse you of being a member of a terror group. Unless and until that is proven or disproven in a court, they can keep you in jail. You will not get bail. Since bail provisions are very stringent, bail will be denied repeatedly. The police will get extended custody. You will spend months and years in jail before the case reaches the court. Now, what if the government misuses the law? What if the police misuse the law? There are no protections here. Let me give you one more example. Under the law, possessing radical material has been equated with terrorist activities. You will be treated as a terrorist if there is radical literature in your possession. Now, some of you might agree with it. You might say that, sir, this is correct. If someone is having radical material with them, it means they are a terrorist. Let me provide a counter argument. Let's say I'm a teacher. I'm teaching internal security. I deal with controversial subjects like terrorism. So for academic purposes, I might have radical literature with me. I might have Maoist doctrine with me. I might have books written by Karl Marx. I want to understand communism. I wanted to understand the doctrine of Maoism, Stalin, Lenin. I might want to understand religious fundamentalism. I might have jihadist material with me. This is purely for academic purposes. Tomorrow, if the police come and arrest me, right, they can actually file cases of terrorism against me under UAPA by saying that I had radical literature in my possession. Now, of course, this case will fall apart in a court, but that will take months and years. Until then, I'll be in jail. I'll not get bail. And I'll be branded a terrorist by the government just because I had radical literature with me. Now, think of another worst case scenario. What if the police plant evidence? What if there is a political motive behind a certain case where the ruling party wants to target the political opponents? It wants to target the critics of the government. So the police might arrest the critics and the opponents and plant radical literature in their possession. It's very easy to do that. In their laptops, in their phones, which is confiscated. What if they download radical material? That is enough to get you arrested, deny bail for months and years, and you will spend your half the lifetime in jail. This is where the law gets misused. Yes, we need stringent provisions to fight terrorism, but there shouldn't be loopholes which can be exploited by the ruling party and by the police and the law enforcement. Now, one way to understand whether a law is being misused is to look at the conviction rate. Conviction rate gives you a great idea whether these laws are effective or not, whether these laws are being misused or not. Now, let me tell you, it is an established fact that under all these laws, conviction rates are extremely low. If let's say 100 cases are filed, right, under these provisions, be it UAPA or previously under TADA, POTA, or even under National Security Act, very small percentage of those cases are convicted. Meaning the prosecution will win the case, meaning these guys were terrorists as proven in court. In majority of the cases have fallen apart. The courts have released the accused due to lack of evidence. So what does it mean? It means only two things. Either your police and law enforcement were so ineffective and incapable that they couldn't collect any evidence even after so many months and years to prove the guilt of the terrorist, to prove that the accused was a terrorist. It's about the lack of capability, lack of proper investigation. That is one thing. Or it means the cases were false to begin with. False charges were filed, innocents were picked up deliberately, maybe due to political vendetta. So many such incidents have happened. That is why UAPA also is very, very controversial. Even courts, higher courts have taken notice of this. The Supreme Court and high courts, right? Whenever they deal with these cases, they have paid attention to this fact that conviction rates are very low. Allegations are coming up again and again that laws are being misused. False charges are being filed. This is where UAPA also becomes controversial. And the same thing happens with NSA, National Security Act of 1980. This law also was never meant for terrorism. It only deals with so-called anti-national activities. It does not clearly define what kind of activities are anti-national. It only says that activities that threaten the sovereignty of India, security of India, India's foreign relations with friendly countries, the law and order security situation in the country, such activities are deemed as anti-national. Now, this is very broad provision. It's not defining terrorism. It's not defining a specific terror act. Now, tomorrow, if you're questioning the government, protesting against the government, can that be labeled as an act against the state, an act against the security of the nation? Right? That's what has happened under this law, especially at the state level. In several states, the state police have filed cases against journalists, activists. Why? Because they were criticizing the government. They were questioning the government. In UP, there is a case, a notorious case, where a journalist has been detained, charged under anti-national activities, just because he was reporting on the inefficiencies of the state government. And here as well, there is no bail. Even today, the journalist is in jail. The case continues. Eventually, it might fall apart due to lack of evidence. The only mistake of the journalist was he wrote negative articles criticizing the government, exposing corruption within the government, exposing the inefficiencies of the state government. But the journalist has been arrested under National Security Act. How is criticizing the government anti-national? It's not, right? Criticizing the government is your right. It's your democratic right. It's a fundamental right. So these laws that we have, they have been ineffective. We have a major problem here. There is a big gap when it comes to our legal framework against terrorism. All the four laws have had the same exact problem. They have very broad and vague provisions, poorly defined provisions. It gives a lot of discretion to the police and the security agencies. This can be misused by ruling parties. They can politicize the cases, they can target critics, political opponents by misusing these laws. So basically, it leads to derailment of justice. Innocents could be targeted. And the worst part is that actual terrorists might get away. Since police and security agencies are focusing on other unnecessary cases, they might lose focus on actual cases. They may not bring up actual evidence against the terrorists. They might actually get away. The conviction rates are very low. That itself proves that there is a lack of capability and a deliberate misuse which is happening. Right? So that is why the anti-terror laws of India are very, very controversial. Fortunately, TADA, POTA no longer exist, but NSA and UAPA, they are still present, and UAPA is the primary anti-terror law that we are using today. Even though it has some new provisions added through amendments, the definitions are still problematic. There are loopholes which can be exploited by the police and security agencies. Is that clear? So it is under this law, it is under the UAPA that terror organizations can be proscribed, meaning they can be designated as a terrorist group by the MHA. Home Ministry has the power under UAPA to designate or proscribe. Proscribing is the legal terminology. It basically means designating a group or notifying that this group is a terrorist group. So MHA has the power to designate any organization which is posing a threat to the security integrity of the nation, right, which is involved in acts of terrorism, killing innocent people. Such groups can be designated by the Home Ministry as terrorist organizations. So under these powers, several extremist outfits in India have been declared as terrorist outfits. Even few global organizations have been declared as terrorist organizations by India. So all the Pakistan-sponsored groups, be it Hizbul Mujahideen, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba, all these outfits, all the Kashmir-based separatist insurgent terror groups, they're all listed as terrorist organizations. All the Khalistan outfits that we have studied, Babar Khalsa International, Khalistan Tiger Force, Sikhs for Justice, all these Khalistani outfits are also listed as terrorist organizations. CPI Maoist, the Naxal outfit in India, all Northeast insurgent groups, even LTTE from Sri Lanka, and global organizations like Al-Qaeda, its branches, Islamic State and its branches, they have all been designated by India as terrorist outfits. Even other extremist outfits involved with terrorism like SIMI, then recently the PFI, Popular Front of India. The PFI calls itself a political organization operating in Karnataka and Kerala, but it is involved with extremist activities, with terror activities. So such groups are also designated as terrorist organizations by the Indian government. This power comes from UAPA. Now this was amended in 2019. Please understand this. Through this amendment, even individual terrorists can be designated by the Indian government. Previously, only organizations could be listed as terrorist organizations. But now, after the amendment, MHA can designate even an individual as a wanted terrorist. So under this power, the MHA has listed many individual terrorists, such as Hafiz Saeed. Who is Hafiz Saeed? Can someone tell me in the comments? He's involved with which terror organization? Hafiz Saeed is with which terror outfit? He's the founder of two major terror groups. Jia has given the right answer. Very good. He is the founder of Lashkar-e-Toiba and its branch organization called Jamaat-ud-Dawa. He is the founder of Jamaat-ud-Dawa, which is like a social organization. Basically, it raises funds for terror activities. But in Pakistan, it's like a NGO. It's like a social organization. It is Jamaat-ud-Dawa which raises funds, which also brings recruits for Lashkar. So Hafiz Saeed is the founder of these organizations, the mastermind of Mumbai attacks. Masood Azhar, the founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed, whom we released from our custody. Right? All these top terrorists, even Dawood Ibrahim, for his involvement with organized crime and terrorism. Right? Then more recently, Khalistani terrorists like Gurpant Singh Panun, who is currently in the US targeting India. He is the founder of Sikhs for Justice. Then Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who was recently killed in Canada. So all such individuals involved in terror activities against India have been listed under this law as wanted terrorists. Is that clear? This power was given to MHA through the latest amendment that was done in 2019. The law does have some good provisions, effective provisions against terrorism. Problem is, there are shortcomings, there are loopholes which can be exploited that leads to violation of fundamental rights and human rights. So I think this is where India should re-examine the laws that we have. Maybe it is time to remove these outdated legislations and bring in a new law against terrorism. Because the kind of terrorism we are dealing with today is very different. You can't have laws from 60s, 70s, and 80s and try to remodel them to apply them today. It has to suit the current circumstances, the new forms of terrorism which is emerging, right? So that is one demand, one concern that exists, and it remains a controversial topic. So please be a little careful when you're talking about these laws. Try to be as neutral as possible. Highlight the pros, but discuss the cons as well. You can criticize the laws, but it should be a valid criticism on these grounds, on the grounds that I have highlighted. Got it? So this is about the legal framework in the country to fight terrorism. Now coming to the next major reform that we have carried out. After Mumbai attacks, the Manmohan Singh government established the National Intelligence Grid, the NAT grid. So let's understand what is NAT grid. This is also a very important topic. It can come as a prelims question as well. UPSC can ask you about NAT grid. What is it? Why is it needed? How does it help in fighting terrorism? Let me explain this. The National Intelligence Grid, it's not an intelligence agency or a law enforcement agency. It's not a security agency at all. It is essentially a IT project. In simple words, it's a IT initiative, an information technology initiative. It is a master database that has been created by the NatGrid. NatGrid is an institution, it's a government institution, which has led a IT project in the country to create a master database that integrates all the existing databases. Is that clear? Now, how will this help in fighting terrorism? That's what you need to understand. Now, see, any terrorist or even a foreign agent of an intelligence agency who are involved in acts of terrorism against India, at some point they will enter the country, right? Either through illegal crossing or maybe sometimes through an airport or a seaport. They will enter India. So sometimes there are records available of the entry of these terrorists and foreign agents into the country. They might enter under a false passport or a false identity, but still the records are documented. The data will be available with Airports Authority of India, the Bureau of Immigration, or maybe with custom officials who are deployed at airports and seaports, or even at land port facilities. Any terrorist or foreign agent, they will procure phones, maybe they'll buy SIM cards, they'll get an internet connection, correct? So telecom service providers and internet service providers, they have valuable data with them. They might have given connections to terrorists and foreign agents as well. The data will be present in their database. These elements, they might be booking flight tickets, they might be booking railway tickets, they might even open bank accounts, they might invest in the stock market. So all the data is already present. Airlines, Indian Railways, that is IRCTC, right? The various mobile apps that we all use, be it for financial transaction, for investing in the stock market, even for hotel bookings, right? So there is a lot of data across industries, across sectors. Any terrorist or foreign agent operating in the country at some point will be leaving a trail of evidence. They might have got credit cards and debit cards. They might be withdrawing money from ATMs, right? This is a trail of evidence. Now, our intelligence and law enforcement agencies may not be able to focus on them if all the data is scattered. These databases are maintained individually by many private companies, government agencies, etc. There's a lot of data with Unique Identification Authority of India, which maintains Aadhaar. A terrorist or a foreign agent might have obtained an Aadhaar card. You need not be an Indian citizen to get Aadhaar card. A resident of India can get Aadhaar card. They might even have a PAN number or a GST number. Is that clear? So they will be leaving some trail of evidence which is not evident for our security and intelligence agencies. Now, what if we integrate all these databases? What if we bring all the major databases together to create one master database and give access to this database to a select group of agencies? This is the idea behind NatGrid. So few intelligence and law enforcement agencies of India, only they have access to NatGrid. So agencies like IB, RAW, NTRO, NIA, CBI, Enforcement Directorate, Narcotics Control Bureau, and few others. Only they have been given limited controlled access to NatGrid. This helps in tracking terrorists, their activities. Anyone who is a suspect, right? They can be tracked. Their movement, their activities can be tracked by the intelligence and security agencies. This is the purpose of NatGrid. But of course, the project raises concerns about data privacy. This could be seen as a violation of your fundamental right. If it is misused, it can be a violation of data protection. It can be a violation of your basic fundamental rights because it can be misused for mass surveillance and even targeted surveillance. That is the fear about NatGrid. That is the concern about NatGrid. Since it has no legal backing and the government is not transparent about how NatGrid functions, the government says very few agencies have access, it's limited controlled access, and the government also has said that there are checks and balances to prevent any misuse of the data. Because this could be used to target anyone in the country. Agencies can monitor your activities. They can monitor your bank accounts, where you're moving, the hotels you're booking, right? Everything can be picked up in an instant by the agencies, and this is a breach of your privacy. It's a breach of your data security, data protection. It could lead to mass surveillance and targeted surveillance, which is a violation of Article 19. Government can easily misuse this to target political opposition, to target journalists, critics, and opponents and activists. So that fear is always there with projects like NatGrid. There is no legal backing, no accountability. So as of now, we just have to believe what the government tells us. The government says it's being used only for legitimate lawful purposes, to fight terrorism, to secure the nation. Correct, such tools are needed, but we need laws as well to prevent the misuse of such surveillance tools. Because NatGrid is enabling targeted surveillance. If it's against a legitimate target, it is fine. If it is against a suspected criminal, a suspected drug trafficker, a suspected terrorist, or a suspected foreign agent, then it is valid. It is necessary in the interest of the country. But if it is used to target innocent civilians, journalists, critics, and opponents, then that is the misuse of these surveillance tools. That's a violation of your fundamental rights. So this is where you need strong data protection laws. India has introduced a data protection law finally, but it gives an exemption for all these agencies. These intelligence and law enforcement agencies are not obligated under the data protection law. So that is why the concern regarding NatGrid remains, that what if it is misused for political purposes? Is that clear? But definitely it aids our fight against terrorism. It's a powerful tool for surveillance. It's basically a master database which has integrated all existing major databases in the country. So these are some of the examples of the measures India has taken to improve our counter-terror architecture. New institutions have been created, laws have been amended, new initiatives have been taken up, right? The overall security framework has become much, much better compared to 15 years ago. We have improved our maritime and coastal security as well, because during 26/11 attacks, the Lashkar terrorists came through the sea route. They set off from Karachi. They passed via Arabian Sea, hijacked a fishing boat, then landed in Mumbai. They breached the defenses of the Navy and the Coast Guard and the coastal police, right? So clearly there were gaps in our coastal and maritime security. We have plugged those gaps as well. The Navy and Coast Guard are more proactive in dealing with such seaborne threats. Intelligence agencies are closely maintaining surveillance, not just in India, but around our neighborhood, to look out for such threats. So definitely India is in a much, much better position, but there are these concerns, points of criticism that I have highlighted. Understood? So this explains India's efforts with regard to counter-terrorism. So please be prepared for this topic. This can be a separate mains question. UPSC might ask you to analyze India's counter-terror architecture. There could be an essay topic that 26/11 attacks was a learning lesson for India, and based on that experience, we have revamped our counter-terror architecture. So related to that, a statement can be given, and UPSC might ask you to write a detailed essay on this. So without this in-depth information, you will not be able to write good answers. Now, along with whatever I've discussed, whatever examples I've given, please take some other examples from current affairs, from newspapers. That's why I told you from the beginning, newspapers are critical for this particular subject. It's heavily driven by current affairs. Whatever new measures we have taken up to counter terrorism that you read in newspapers, please add that as well into these topics. Now let's come to the last part of the discussion here. Let's look at India's global efforts to fight terrorism. Right now, we have seen our domestic efforts, what the government has done within the country. Now let's look at global diplomatic efforts and how we are countering terrorism. India is using the UN platform very effectively, especially after 2008. At the UN, we are targeting Pakistan and any form of state-sponsored terrorism. India's coercive diplomacy has been very effective in raising the issue of terrorism at the global level. Through United Nations, we proposed a convention in 1996 called CCIT. In the last class, someone was asking, sir, do we have a UN convention to fight terrorism? Now let me answer that question. We do not have a global convention to fight terrorism. There is no UN convention to fight terrorism. There is a convention proposed by India. India proposed it in 96. We still push this convention. We still ask for support for getting this convention adopted. But however, due to lack of global support, the convention has not been adopted. Is that clear? So India proposed a convention, the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, or CCIT. Since then, we are pushing it every year. Every time a discussion comes up on the subject of terrorism at UN General Assembly or at the UN Security Council, every time we address the UNGA summit in September, right? Usually our foreign minister or prime minister, they personally attend the UN summits. Our diplomats who engage with UN and other UN members regularly, they keep bringing up this issue and we keep giving a push for this convention. We're trying to raise global support so that when it goes for voting in the General Assembly and Security Council, it gets enough support to get it adopted. But it's been almost 30 years. Due to lack of global support, the convention has not been adopted by the UN. That's why I told you there is no global convention to fight terrorism. There is one initiative taken by India. We have pushed for it, but we are not getting adequate support. So it's also important to understand why we are not getting global support. We have to look at what India is suggesting, what provisions are we recommending, and why other countries have a problem with it. So let's take a quick look at this. The convention proposed by India has one positive aspect. It provides for a universal definition of terrorism. It seeks to cover all forms of terrorism. It does not distinguish between any extremist group. Any group engaging in extremist violence, any group engaging in radical extremist activity, they all get covered under this convention, under this definition of terrorism. Is that clear? If this convention is adopted, let's say UN adopts it, then every UN member will be obligated, all 193 UN states, they will be obligated to adopt a national law through their respective parliaments and legislatures. They have to bring out a national legislation which is in line with the CCIT convention. They have to declare all forms of terrorism as a criminal activity, and they have to commit that they will deny any support to terrorist activities. Meaning, they will not allow terror groups to have a safe haven on their soil. They will not allow terror sanctuaries to be present in their country. They will deny any support with regard to funding and supply of weapons to terrorist groups. They will act against terror groups operating from their country. They will shut down all the terror camps and they will prosecute all the terrorists under special anti-terror laws. Is that clear? And terrorists who are engaged in cross-border terrorism, who are getting state support, basically, if they are finding support in one country and launching attacks against another country, such terrorists have to be apprehended, and this should be made an extraditable offense, meaning they should be handed over to the countries where they are wanted. Is that clear? So the convention proposed by India basically targets Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. Countries like Pakistan, which have sponsored, supported terrorism, hosted terrorists, which have not acted against terrorists, they will be obligated under the convention to adopt these stringent measures to act against terrorism. But these provisions suggested by India creates a problem for many countries. Because as we have studied, Pakistan is not the only state sponsor of terrorism. There are many other major powers which also have been involved with terror groups. Remember, in the last class I told you that some countries distinguish between so-called good terrorism and bad terrorism. There are countries misusing terrorism for geopolitics, for their respective geopolitical interests. Like Iran, for example. Iran sponsors radical extremist organizations and it will not act against them. Iran sponsors Hamas. It sponsors Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, UAE, Qatar. They're all involved with terrorist organizations. They are using religious fundamentalism, misusing religion for their geopolitical interests. Same with United States. The US is one of the major powers which has been closely involved with various terrorist outfits, from Afghan Mujahideen to the initial origin of Islamic State, and many other terror organizations have received support from US. European countries have been involved with terrorist outfits. Russia and China, even they have sponsored terror groups to achieve their geopolitical agenda. So none of them want this convention to be adopted because they know that they themselves will be held accountable later. Correct? In Syria and Iraq, for example, US has worked with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda to target their rival governments. In Afghanistan, US has worked with extremist forces which can be labeled as terrorist organizations. So many big powers are involved in this. They distinguish between so-called good and bad terrorism. They only target bad terrorists who attack them. They support others who target their rivals, their geopolitical rivals, and they are using terrorism as a geopolitical weapon. So all these countries are not interested in this convention. They don't want to be held accountable for their acts. They want to continue using terrorism as a geopolitical weapon. Is that clear? Then we also have others like Latin American countries which have opposed the CCAT convention. They are worried that the convention pushed by India is very stringent because they know about India's anti-terror laws. They know the controversies associated with UAPA, TADA, POTA. So they fear that if India's convention is adopted, it will lead to very stringent laws, which could lead to human rights violations and abuses. What if authoritarian countries adopt laws depending on this convention and misuse those laws to target their critics and opponents? That is a fear Latin American countries have expressed. That is why they are not supporting India. They believe the provisions are too stringent. They know India's history of controversial laws against terrorism. They fear that it could lead to similar stringent laws in other countries, in autocratic countries, where the governments can misuse these laws in the name of fighting terrorism to target their critics and opponents. So South American, Central American, Caribbean countries, they are not supporting it. There are others who are members of OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. These countries are also opposing it because they want an exception to be given to Palestinian outfits. Because many countries that are members of OIC, they don't look at Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist outfits. According to them, these are national liberation movements fighting for liberation of Palestine from Israel. So they want exceptions to be given here. So because of these differences, we haven't got global support. That is why CCAT convention has not been adopted. All right. But still, it's an Indian effort through the UN to have a universal definition of terrorism to target all forms of terrorism, especially state-sponsored terrorism. So you can cite that as an example of India's global efforts. Next, we have used 1267 Sanctions Committee of UN Security Council to target certain terrorists who are getting state support. Let's discuss this. Let me explain this. It's a very important topic. UNSC 1267 Sanctions Committee. What is this Sanctions Committee? What sanctions will apply if terrorists are proscribed or designated by it? How India has used it. That's something you should know. This is called UNSC 1267 Sanctions Committee because it was established in 1999 through UNSC resolution number 1267. UN Security Council adopts few resolutions. So through resolution number 1267, the members of UNSC, the 5 permanent members and the 10 non-permanent members, they adopted a resolution through which this sanctions committee was set up to act against terrorism. It was initially set up by the UNSC to target the Taliban, because Taliban had come into power in Afghanistan and it was threatening Western interests and global security. So UNSC adopted this resolution to mainly list Taliban terrorists and to impose sanctions on them. That's why it was also called Taliban Sanctions Committee. Later, it was used to target Al-Qaeda terrorists after 9/11. It's also called Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee. And now, it's been used to target Islamic State. So it's also called ISIS or ISIL or Daesh Sanctions Committee. It's known by different informal names. Officially, it is the 1267 Sanctions Committee of UN Security Council. Informally, it's also called Taliban Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee or Daesh or ISIS ISIL Sanctions Committee. Daesh is the Arabic name for Islamic State. Is that clear? So, through this sanctions committee, individual terrorists who are involved in major acts of terrorism, who are seen as a global threat, they can be designated as global terrorists. Is that clear? Any UN member can propose the names of individual terrorists, but it has to be supported by the members of UNSC. All the 15 countries have to support. So any UN member can propose the listing of a global terrorist by giving supporting evidence to show that this terrorist is involved in major acts of terrorism against this country and that these guys are a threat to the global peace and stability. So if it is supported by all the 15 members, that is, if consensus is there within the Security Council, then they will be listed as a global terrorist. All right, all 15 countries, the 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members, all 15 have to support. So consensus is needed. Even if one country does not support, the resolution will fall apart. Got it? Now let's say India has proposed a name. We have given enough evidence. 14 countries are supporting India. They are agreeing that this guy is a terrorist who is a threat. We have to list him under the sanctions committee. But if one member of UNSC does not support it, it will fall apart. That individual cannot be listed as a global terrorist. Now, what kind of sanctions will apply? If a global terrorist is designated, what are the sanctions that will apply against them? There are 3 types of sanctions that apply. Please make a note. 1. Every UN member is obligated to freeze all the funds, accounts, and financial assets owned by the terrorist related to the terrorist. Basically, it leads to an economic sanction. The terrorist who has been designated, he might be having a lot of financial assets, right? Personal wealth of that individual or even that owned by the family, friends, known accomplices, right? Whatever wealth that individual has, not just on his personal account, but even that owned by their friends, family members, and the accomplices known to him. All those funds, accounts, and financial assets, including land, property, everything has to be frozen by the UN member states. The idea is to impose an economic sanction to cut off the terrorists from access to funds. Next, UN members are obligated to curb the movement of these sanctioned terrorists. It curbs their right to movement. They can't move from one country to another. It means if they detect their presence in their country, they have to arrest them. Let's say there is a UN designated terrorist trying to enter a country. If that country realizes that this is a wanted global terrorist, they can't allow him to move. They have to detain, arrest that terrorist and eventually extradite them, hand them over to the country where they are wanted. So it curbs their movement. It leads to the arrest of the terrorist. Then finally, UN members are obligated to restrict access to weapons to these terrorists. UN members have to work to ensure that these terrorists cannot access arms, weapons, and explosives, because that is how they are organizing terror attacks, which means you have to tackle organized crime. You have to tackle arms trafficking as well, because that is how the terrorists are procuring arms and weapons. So these are the sanctions that apply. These are the obligations of all UN member states. One is an economic sanction, a curb on right to movement, and restriction of access to weapons and arms and explosives. The sanctions are designed to limit the ability of the terrorists to organize and plan attacks. Is that clear? India has used this platform quite effectively. We have got many terrorists listed, like Hafiz Saeed. After the Mumbai attacks, India clearly blamed Hafiz Saeed and his organization, Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jamaat-ud-Dawa. We got enough evidence to prove his involvement in the activities of Lashkar and Jamaat-ud-Dawa and got him designated as a global terrorist. The global sympathy support was in favor of India. India leveraged that. We influenced Western countries and the members of UNSC and got support from all of them to list Hafiz Saeed as a global terrorist. Then many others, even Dawood Ibrahim, for his involvement in the Bombay blasts, for his continued support to Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. Then Zaki-ur-Rahman Lakwi, another mastermind of the Mumbai attacks. Many such top terrorists of Lashkar, even Jaish and Hizbul Mujahideen and others, they have been designated by India. India took the initiative. India pushed the designation of these terrorists. We got the support of others and got them designated. But India struggled to get Masood Azhar designated. We have been trying to designate Masood Azhar since the Mumbai attacks, since 2008. India made 4 to 5 attempts for 10 years to get Masood Azhar designated. He was responsible for parliament attacks. Jaish-e-Mohammed has been responsible for many attacks against India. But still we could not get his designation because of China. China was not supporting the proposal by India in order to protect Pakistan. China was giving technical reasons. It was saying that India has not given enough evidence to show that he's involved in these attacks, that Jaish-e-Mohammed was involved in these attacks. China said India has not given evidence to show that he's in Pakistan, supported by Pakistani state. By giving such excuses and reasons, it kept pushing these proposals again and again. China did this with Hafiz Saeed as well, to protect Pakistan-sponsored terrorists. But because of Mumbai attacks, there was global outrage. There was global support and sympathy in favor of India. So all other UN countries pushed China to not block the designation of Hafiz Saeed or Zaki-ur-Rahman Lakwi. That is why India could designate them. But in case of Masood Azhar, China kept blocking it repeatedly. We tried for almost 10 years, from 2009 to 2019. 4 to 5 attempts were made, not just by India, even by US, France, and Russia. But China would not give it up. But finally, after Pulwama attacks, and after India carried out Balkot airstrikes, the tensions had gone up between India and Pakistan. It appeared that we are going to another war. So then US, UK, France, and Russia took the matter very seriously, and they pushed China, convinced China to give this up so that they can please India and convince India to not go to war. So after Pulwama attacks, China lifted the block, and Masood Azhar also now has been designated as a global terrorist. There are many more names we are pursuing. We have a list of 5 to 8 terrorists. We want them to be designated as well. But even now, China is using the same tactic. It still has a block on the designation of certain names pushed by India. Just last year, we finally succeeded in designating few more terrorists. For example, Sajid Mir. India believes he was a former Pakistani army officer and an ISI agent who masterminded the Mumbai attacks, who worked with Lashkar and masterminded the Mumbai attacks. We were trying to designate Sajid Mir. We had solid evidence to prove his involvement, but China kept blocking it. But last year, we managed to get some support, and we have listed and designated few terrorists. But still, we have few more names, and China still keeps blocking it again and again. So this is another example of India's global effort through the UN to target state-sponsored terrorism. Is that clear? So there are many more examples. For example, India uses another platform, that is FATF, Financial Action Task Force, to counter terrorist financing and to counter money laundering, which is linked with organized crime and terrorist financing. Through FATF as well, we have tried targeting Pakistan, because Pakistan has not implemented FATF measures. It had failed to implement the anti-money laundering, counter-terror financing measures. Pakistan has enabled terrorist financing by funding multiple terror groups. So we've used the FATF platform to get Pakistan grey listed multiple times by FATF. Pakistan has been grey listed at least 3 times. And every time India has been involved with US, France, and others. So with such global support, we have used FATF as well to target Pakistan, mainly to target terrorist financing. We will study more about this under the money laundering chapter. There I will explain what is FATF, what are these FATF standards, and how does it help in fighting terrorism and money laundering. We will study that again tomorrow under the money laundering chapter. But for now, this is enough. We are also working with our bilateral partners. We are also using multilateral organizations to fight terrorism. We work with close friends like US, European Union, United Kingdom, Russia, Japan, Australia, even our neighboring countries like Sri Lanka, for example, Bangladesh, and many more. Right? You can add UAE, Saudi Arabia, all these countries to the list. We have fantastic relations with them. We have built close security defense relations as well. And counterterrorism is a focus area in our diplomacy as well. We sign agreements with them to improve our defense and security ties. So we provide for intelligence sharing, right? Cooperation between our intelligence agencies that deal with counterterrorism, cooperation between law enforcement agencies to arrest the terrorists and prosecute them. We even conduct joint military exercises focused on counterterrorism. This is what we do through bilateral relations of India. Then we work with many multilateral groupings like BIMSTEC. We work closely with ASEAN, European Union, then even BRICS, SCO, the Quad grouping. They all prioritize counter-terror cooperation. We also have Colombo Security Conclave, major grouping in the Indian Ocean led by India. All these groups, right, even IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, these regional groups and multilateral organizations are used by India to promote counter-terror cooperation. So kindly remember these points. This could again be a separate mains question. UPSC can ask you, analyze India's global efforts to counter terrorism in detail. You have to talk about CCIT Convention, 1267 Sanctions Committee, FATF, our bilateral and multilateral initiatives. Just these basic points are enough to build your answer and ensure that you get the maximum marks. It's about the quality of the points that you add in your answer. It's not about how much you write. It's about the relevance of the argument that you're making in the answer, right? So that is where I think this discussion will help you. With this, we come to the last part. After that, we'll close this chapter itself. We can end this chapter for today. Let's talk about major terrorist organizations in the world. Just a brief introduction. I want you guys to know at least the names of some major terrorist groups. Where do they operate? What threat do they pose to India? What global threat do they pose? At least some basic awareness about these terrorist organizations. Because there can be a prelims question as well. UPSC might ask, where does ETIM operate? It's a terror group operating in which country or in which region, right? Such basic questions can come in prelims, or maybe there could be another mains question. Write a note on global terrorism. Discuss the major terrorist outfits of the world and the threat they pose to India. So such questions might come and you have to be prepared for it. So I'll give you a basic introduction. Be familiar with them. That's more than enough. You don't have to dive into all the details. There is one major group called ARSA. Has anyone heard about this organization? Can someone tell me where does it operate? Any idea which country does ARSA operate? What is the full form? Anything you know about ARSA? It's usually in current affairs. If you're reading newspapers, you would have heard about a group called ARSA. Pooja says Taliban. No. Gaurav says it is in Bangladesh. No, incorrect. ARSA stands for the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. It's a terror group formed by few radical Rohingyas. See, who are Rohingyas? Rohingyas are ethnic Muslim minorities found in Myanmar. Very good. Now some students have given the answer. Kola, Gulam Mustafa, Gaurav, Ganesh, Tanuja, Shilpa. They've all given the right answer. In Myanmar, Rohingya Muslims have been persecuted by radical Buddhists and by Myanmar's army. They have faced a lot of oppression, discrimination, targeted communal violence. As a result of this, some Rohingyas have been radicalized. They have taken up terrorism to fight against Myanmar's army and the radical Buddhists in the country. So this outfit operating in Myanmar could be a threat to India as well. Because Indian intelligence agencies believe that ARSA has connections with Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Toiba and Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. ARSA could legitimately target India because we have never criticized Myanmar's army for the violations it has committed against Rohingyas. And also don't forget, India is the birthplace of Buddhism. We have sacred Buddhist sites in India. So ARSA targets Buddhist sites because they have been targeted by radical Buddhists in Myanmar. In fact, one attempt was made by ARSA at Bodh Gaya in Bihar. It was a failed attack. It didn't succeed. But India linked this attempt at Bodh Gaya a few years ago with this Rohingya terror group from Myanmar. And also, of late, India has been hostile to Rohingya refugees. Since Myanmar has continued the oppression of Rohingyas, recently there was a major refugee crisis in 2016, 2017. During that period, India said we will not accept Rohingya refugees. We said we will identify the existing refugees in India and will send them back to Myanmar. So the government of India became a little hostile towards Rohingya refugees. So that could also be a motivation for ARSA to target India. So we do keep a close watch on this outfit, mainly because of its connections with other terror organizations, and also because it could have a legitimate interest in targeting India. Then Afghan Taliban, which we have studied. Currently, it's in power. It has formed the government, the interim government. Previously, we were very clear that Taliban is a terrorist outfit. When it came to power in 1996 for the first time, the Taliban was very clearly pro-Pakistan. It sheltered many anti-India terror groups. It even threw out Indian diplomats from Afghanistan. So we cut off all ties with Afghanistan. We did not recognize the Taliban government, and we labeled Taliban as a terrorist organization. But technically speaking, Taliban is actually a radical political organization, more of an insurgent outfit. So some countries started engaging with Taliban. As Taliban became stronger and stronger, right? Iran, China, Russia, even US itself started engaging with Taliban. Initially, it had sheltered Al-Qaeda. It had become a hotspot for all the terrorists because the Taliban regime from 96 to 2001 gave complete shelter and support for all these terrorist outfits. Osama bin Laden, the founder of Al-Qaeda, was hosted by the Taliban regime. But after 9/11 attacks, the US invaded Afghanistan with a coalition force, toppled the Taliban government, and since then it started targeting the Taliban. But Taliban made a resurgence. It regrouped. It rebuilt its capacities, increased its influence, and eventually it pushed out the foreign troops. The US struck a deal with Taliban itself before quitting the country. Right? US and Taliban negotiated with each other. They struck a peace deal, and now Taliban has toppled the civilian government in 2021. In 2021, it toppled the Afghan government and it has captured power again in the country. It's not just the US which has struck a deal with Taliban, even many other powers have negotiated with Taliban to protect their own interests. They just want to ensure that Afghan territory is not used by terror groups which are a threat to other countries. So India was left with no other choice after 2021 but to negotiate with Taliban, because that became the reality. Because the US ignored India entirely in the peace process. We were very close to the Afghan government. We had invested billions of dollars to reconstruct Afghanistan. Now that Taliban came back to power, it became a necessity for India to talk to Taliban and engage with Taliban. So right now, even though we don't have official ties with Taliban, we haven't recognized the Taliban regime, we have reopened our talks with Taliban. We have reopened the embassy, the Indian embassy in Kabul. Indian diplomats have been sent back, and we have started maintaining direct contact with Taliban. We are talking to the Taliban right now. Understood? Once Taliban came back to power, we started engaging with Taliban just like every other country. So it is an interim government right now, but it remains a credible threat, mainly because of its radical ideology, its association with other terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Is that clear? Now, one faction of Afghan Taliban is of particular concern for India, which is the Haqqani network. Remember, I had given this example when we discussed terrorism in the last weekend. It was founded in the 1990s by Jalaluddin Haqqani, a notorious terrorist from the Af-Pak border. He has mainly operated in the tribal areas of Pakistan, in the border regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is where Jalaluddin Haqqani set up the Haqqani faction, which is a branch of the Taliban. And Pakistan has used this group to carry out multiple attacks against Indian interests inside Afghanistan. Our embassy, our consulates, our projects have been targeted by this terror group. Pakistan is behind it. Haqqani network is responsible for the bombing of Indian embassy in Kabul. Indian diplomats were killed. Indian intelligence and military officers deployed in Afghanistan were killed. Indian workers were kidnapped by this group. So Haqqani network remains a threat. And let me tell you the worst part. Currently, this group is headed by Sirajuddin Haqqani. Sirajuddin Haqqani is the leader of the group. And who is this guy? He is the son of Jalaluddin Haqqani. Now, Sirajuddin Haqqani is a designated terrorist under the sanctions committee. Understood? He was sanctioned by UNSC under the 1267 sanctions committee. He's a globally wanted terrorist. It is Sirajuddin Haqqani who worked for the ISI to launch attacks against Indian embassy and consulates in Afghanistan. So this wanted terrorist listed by the UN is responsible for the killing of Indian officials. Now, believe it or not, he is the interior minister of the Taliban government. Meaning he is the home minister. And we are forced to deal with him. We have to talk to him. He is a wanted terrorist responsible for killing Indian officials. But as part of the Taliban regime, he has become the interior minister. So this is a challenge that India faces. Then, of course, Al-Qaeda, which was founded by Osama bin Laden, responsible for major attacks, mainly against Western countries. Al-Qaeda has targeted US and West European countries primarily. Its main base of operation was Afghanistan. But Al-Qaeda's ideology had spread and many branches had come up, like AQAP, AQIM. AQAP is Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula. It is based out of Yemen. In fact, back in 1990s, this branch of Al-Qaeda carried out an attack against a US naval ship, which was near Yemen. Near the coast of Yemen, there was a US naval ship which was attacked by this branch of Al-Qaeda, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula. AQIM is another Al-Qaeda branch. It stands for Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. It mainly operates in the Sahel region of Africa. If you open the map of Africa, you have the Sahara region, you have North Africa. Between that, in the sub-Saharan region, from the Atlantic till the Red Sea, you have a number of countries. You have Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, Sudan. All these countries present in this part of sub-Saharan Africa, between North Africa and Sahara region. That is the Sahel region. It's a geographical term. Sahel region of Africa refers to these countries. This is where Al-Qaeda has a major presence and influence even today. They want to throw all the governments out here and form a Islamic Maghreb, which they call as an Islamic State. So many countries here are affected by radical activity, terrorist activity. In fact, US, UK and France especially, they were trying to target these groups. They deployed troops as well in Mali, Niger, in Chad, in Burkina Faso, in Mauritania. These are all French colonies and British colonies. So France and UK primarily were involved in anti-terror operations with help of US. But recently they have withdrawn all these operations. Because of increasing terrorism, increasing unviability of their operations, France pulled out all the troops. US, UK also have reduced their focus, thus making the Sahel region of Africa a hub for radical terrorists who are aligned with Al-Qaeda's ideology. Is that clear? So these have been the different branches of Al-Qaeda. Next, the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. It's essentially the Pakistan branch of Taliban. Essentially, there are two factions of the Taliban. See, Taliban is a byproduct of Afghan Mujahideen. We have studied about Afghan Mujahideen in previous classes. How after the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, US, Saudi Arabia and others worked with Pakistan to create Afghan Mujahideen. They radicalized the Pashtuns in Afghanistan and Pakistan to create Afghan Mujahideen as a resistance against the Soviet forces. After the Mujahideen succeeded in defeating the Soviet forces, the Soviet Union retreated. And some of the young radical terrorists who are part of Afghan Mujahideen, they broke out to create the Taliban. The Taliban was a more radical student-led organization founded by a terrorist known as Mullah Omar. This group, which mainly comprised of Pashtuns from Afghanistan and Pakistan, it split into two parts. One is the Afghan Taliban, which today is in power in Afghanistan. The goal of Afghan Taliban was to remove the government, capture power, so they can establish the Sharia rule. They can establish an Islamic emirate and enforce their rigid version of the Sharia. Similarly, the Pakistan branch of Taliban has the same goal. They want to target the Pakistani government. They want to target the Pakistani army, the ISI, the Pakistani state, throw the state out and capture power in Pakistan. This is their agenda. This is their goal. Because they want to establish an Islamic emirate, enforce their version of a Sharia, and promote their religious fundamentalism. Now, this group is a major threat for the very existence of Pakistan. In the last few years, the TTP has become very dangerous and it has been carrying out major attacks against Pakistan. A few years ago, you might have heard about a very brutal attack in Peshawar. Around 150 school children were killed. A school was bombed by a terror group. 150 children were killed in Peshawar. This brutal attack was carried out by the TTP. Recently, you might have heard about attacks against Pakistani army. A Pakistani air base was attacked. All these attacks are carried out by TTP. So it's a major threat for the very existence and survival of Pakistan, and it has become very active in the last 2 years because it does get support from Afghan Taliban. They are like brother organizations. Afghan Taliban, it has ties with Pakistan Taliban. It does give some support to it. Now, what is very interesting is that this has created issues between Pakistan and Afghan Taliban government. When Afghan Taliban came to power in 2021, Pakistan struck a deal which was negotiated by Afghan Taliban. A peace deal was worked out because Pakistan desperately wanted it as TTP was posing a threat. So Afghan Taliban, which formed the government in Afghanistan, used its influence, pushed the TTP to talk to Pakistan, and a ceasefire was established between them. But in 2022, TTP broke the deal. TTP has broken the deal and it has started attacking Pakistan. And Pakistan blames Afghan Taliban for allowing the TTP to operate in the border areas. Pakistan Taliban terrorists, they get support from Afghan Taliban. They hide in Afghanistan and they target Pakistan. So this has become a concern for Pakistan, leading to divisions between Pakistan and Afghan Taliban itself. So that is a very interesting development. Sometimes Pakistan accuses India of sponsoring TTP, especially when we had a friendly government in Afghanistan, when the Afghan civilian government was there. Pakistan would allege that India's RAW and Afghan's intelligence agency, the NDS, allegedly they were sponsoring TTP to target Pakistan. But this is just an allegation. Pakistan has never been able to bring any evidence to show that India is sponsoring TTP. These are just baseless allegations that Pakistan keeps making against India. Right? India has denied these allegations, and as far as we know in the public domain, we don't have such ties with TTP. We do monitor the group, right? We may have maybe some contacts, but India, at least as of what we know, doesn't engage with TTP as it's a very dangerous organization, and it's unlikely that India would be sponsoring it. Because if TTP succeeds, that is a worst case scenario for India. Some of you might be shocked, right? You might think we want the fall of Pakistan, right? Some Indians might think that Pakistan should be destroyed, right? Mainly because of the enmity that is there. But trust me, no country, especially India, would not like to see the fall of the Pakistani state. If it ever comes to that point, India will do everything possible to protect the Pakistani state. Why? Because Pakistan has nuclear weapons. If the state collapses, if it is taken over by terrorists, it's a nightmare for India, a nightmare for the US, a nightmare for every country in the region. So it is in India's interest to ensure that Pakistan is a stable country. Even if it is run by the army and the ISI, even if we have rivalries with the country, eventually the state is much better than the terror groups running over the state. Right now, the situation is getting dangerous day by day. Pakistan's economy has collapsed. Internally, there is a political crisis going on. Opposition leaders have been arrested. Election is about to be held next month. In Feb, elections will happen, which will obviously be controlled by the army and the ISI. So economically and politically, Pakistan is going through a lot of turbulence. At the same time, there is a security crisis, a dangerous crisis where TTP has become stronger and it's carrying out major attacks. And now you have the new situation with Iran, where just a few days ago, Iran launched strikes against Pakistan and Pakistan has retaliated, right? So this is a dangerous combination for Pakistan because groups like TTP can exploit this. They can possibly run over the state, leading to the potential collapse of the Pakistani state. So TTP does pose a concern for India and the whole world because no one would like to see the collapse of Pakistan. Is that clear? No matter how much you dislike Pakistani state, never ever wish for the collapse of Pakistani state. That is the worst wish you can have. Because if Pakistani state collapses, terror groups like TTP and others will run over, giving them access to advanced weaponry, including nuclear weapons. Is that clear? That's why I told you. Be it India, be it US, no country would like to see the fall of Pakistan if it gets to that point. Right? If we get to that worst case scenario, every country, including India, they will do everything possible to protect the Pakistani state. It might seem unreal, but you never know, right? We live in a very interesting world. If such developments were to happen, we will stand with Pakistani army and ISI if required to protect the Pakistani state. Got it? Next, another major outfit, ETIM. It stands for East Turkestan Islamic Movement. The East Turkestan Islamic Movement. Any idea where does it operate? Does anyone know? Does anyone know where ETIM operates? Turkey? No. Just because there is Turkestan doesn't mean it's in Turkey. Nikhil has given the right answer. Very good. It operates in China. Have you heard of the Xinjiang province in China? Here you have a native community called the Uyghur Muslims. See, the Xinjiang region was forcefully captured by China after the Communist Party won the civil war. Right, the Maoists who established People's Republic of China, they started forcefully annexing territories to increase China's territory. Tibet was captured in 1950. Parallelly, these parts of Xinjiang, which was part of Central Asia, was also captured by China. Since then, the native Uyghur Muslims have been targeted by a communist China. In communism, religion has no significance. Communists often promote atheism, but Uyghurs were deeply religious. So this led to a clash. And Uyghurs have felt oppressed, discriminated by the Chinese state. And some of the Uyghurs who have been oppressed and discriminated, they have been radicalized. Because in Central Asia, there are many radical groups which are connected with Afghan and Pakistan groups. There are many terrorist radical organizations in the AFPAK belt. It's a hub of radicalism and terrorism. They have influences, connections in Central Asia, and ETIM is one such Uyghur outfit, which has connections with other terror groups in the region. Some of the radical Uyghurs who are fighting against China, they have formed this terror group. They target the Chinese state. They carry out attacks in Xinjiang, but they get funds, training, and weapons from the Afghanistan-Pakistan region and other parts of Central Asia. So this group is a threat to China. Is that clear? So China targets this outfit and it expects others to support China. Now look at China's hypocrisy. Here, China expresses concern as well about terrorism present in Afghanistan-Pakistan region, because China knows that ETIM is getting support from this region. But it does not act against anti-India terror groups, which are also based out of the same region. At groupings like BRICS, SCO, and even UN, China highlights Uyghur terrorism, but it doesn't take any action against Pakistan-sponsored terrorism against India. This is the hypocrisy of China. So ETIM is a radical Uyghur movement. Some Uyghur Muslims who have been radicalized, they lead this terrorist movement. They want to liberate Xinjiang from China, break it apart and form East Turkestan. Next, we have Islamic State, the ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, known by different names, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, but it all refers to the same outfit. ISIS stands for Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. That's where it was based out of. ISIL stands for Islamic State in Levant region. Levant is a geographical region in West Asia. It's present around Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel. This region is called the Levant. Is that clear? The region where Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel are present, even Lebanon. This whole region is called the Levant in West Asia. So this is where the terror group is mainly based off. That's why it's called ISIL, Islamic State in Levant region. Or ISIS stands for Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, where it had established territorial control. In Arabic, it's called Daesh. Daesh roughly translates to a Islamic caliphate. Basically, a Islamic state. Just like Khalistani extremists want a Khalistan, which is a sacred land for the Sikhs, right? On similar lines, there is a religious reference to this, the caliphate, a land of Muslims where there is prosperity, where there is the customary laws that are enforced. But this is given a wrong interpretation. This is a misinterpretation of Quran and a radical interpretation by these extremist elements. Under the radical ideology of Salafism, Wahhabism, these extremists have twisted the faith and in the name of religion, they carry out these atrocities. So you can see this in every faith, as we discussed from the very first class. So I would like to have a small discussion on ISIS, but I think we can do it after a break. Right? It's already been more than 1.5 hours. We'll take a short break. We'll come back and we will discuss about ISIS and the few remaining terror groups, and I will close this discussion. Because I want to help you understand the origin of ISIS and how ISIS spread its ideology. What threat did it pose to the world? Does it pose any threat to India? Right? That is something we should understand. And there are few other groups, including Hamas, which has hit the global headlines. There are few new groups that have come in news. Jaish al-Adl and the other Baloch groups in Iran and Pakistan. I would like to make a mention of them as well, given that they're all in current affairs. Trust me, this knowledge, this awareness is essential. It's important. Even if you don't get a direct question, you can take the names of these groups while you're writing answers. Let's say there is a question on terrorism in general, an essay topic on terrorism, a question on global terrorism. How will you write about it without knowing about some basic terror organizations in the world, right? So let's continue this discussion. We'll wrap it up. I'll discuss some PYQs later, but we'll take a short break. Let's take a 15 minutes break. It's almost 2. Please come back by 2:15. All right, we'll start at 2:15 and we'll take a longer break later, maybe between 3:30 to 4. We'll take a longer break. I think for now, 15 minutes should be enough. So I'll see you back in few minutes. In 15 minutes, we'll come back at 2:15. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the session. Apologies for the 15 minutes delay. There was a unavoidable circumstance. So for 15 minutes, we had to delay the class. So let's resume the discussion. We were about to end the chapter on terrorism. We were talking about the global terror organizations, and I had started with the discussion on ISIS or Islamic State. I said that it's important to understand the origin and spread of ISIS, especially the manner in which the organization grew, the kind of threat it posed to the world, and the current status of ISIS is something that's very important for our exams. Islamic State or ISIS, it was primarily centered around the Iraq-Syria region. It formally declared the formation of the so-called Islamic Caliphate after capturing a large territory in Iraq and Syria in the year 2014. That is when the name ISIS or Daesh became globally notorious. The leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he was the founder of ISIS, the leader of the terrorist organization. He declared in 2014 that Islamic Caliphate had been created by capturing large territory in Iraq and Syria. He declared himself as the Caliph, the leader of the Islamic world. But ISIS did not originate in 2014 itself. There is a history behind it. There is a background behind it. So it's important to understand that and talk about its rise and how it increased its reach phenomenally by relying on social media platforms. ISIS was one of the first major terrorist organizations in the world to effectively use the internet and social media platforms to spread radical ideology. Because tomorrow we will study about the misuse of social media, the security threats coming from internet-based platforms. So this would be a perfect example. Because the model that ISIS used to spread its ideology and to gain global influence is something that we should pay attention with regard to securing our interests. If we have to ensure security not just in India but around the world, we have to understand how radical groups can misuse internet and social media platforms. So this outfit, founded by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, it rose to prominence in 2014. It declared the creation of the caliphate in 2014. But its origin goes back to the Iraq war that began in 2003 and the civil war in Syria that started in 2011. It's in this conflict that you find the origin of this outfit. In 2003, the United States, along with United Kingdom, they generated false intelligence against Iraq. Some of the leaders of US and UK, along with their military and intelligence setup, they raised false allegations that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction, that is WMDs. This was blatant lies by US and UK. Some elements within the US and UK administration under the then George Bush government and the Tony Blair government in UK, they lied blatantly to the world, to their own people, and based on the basis of this false intelligence, they alleged that Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq, was developing WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. By using this as an excuse, they invaded Iraq. US and UK, they went to war in Iraq, and their actual intention was to remove Saddam Hussein from power, to expand their geopolitical influence, to control the oil markets, and to remove an unfavorable regime They generated falsified intelligence alleging that Iraq was developing WMDs. This led to the destruction of stability in Iraq. This war, unnecessary war, triggered by US and UK, it toppled the Saddam Hussein government. See, Saddam Hussein was a dictator. He was an authoritarian leader. But however, Iraq was a stable country. There was a strong government, there was governance, law and order was being maintained. So as a result, Iraq did not have any space for extremism. I'm not praising Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is no figure to be praised. He was an authoritarian leader. There's no denying it. But at least the dictatorial rule had maintained a sense of stability in Iraq. Saddam Hussein would never give space for any radical extremist terrorist elements to flourish in Iraq. This stability was destroyed by US and UK through this unnecessary war. They threw out Saddam Hussein from power, achieved their geopolitical goal. But after the removal of Saddam Hussein, complete chaos broke out in Iraq. A civil war broke out between different factions. There were some Shia armed groups, some Sunni armed groups. There were some armed organizations loyal to Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist party. They all started fighting against each other, mainly for control of power, for control over resources. Because don't forget, Iraq is one of the top oil suppliers. Even to India, Iraq has been a top oil supplier. We had very good ties with Saddam Hussein. So once Saddam Hussein was removed and the foreign troops, they had destabilized the country, it created a fertile ground for these extremists to exploit. There was no government, no law and order, no security agencies. The government had fallen apart. Foreign troops could no longer control the situation. Eventually, US, UK retreated from Iraq. After a few years, by 2010-11, they retreated from Iraq. But this chaos that they had created, the civil war which had triggered between different factions and sectarian groups, created this ground for religious fundamentalism to thrive. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who at one point was getting support from US itself, broke out and started a radical armed movement. A movement built on religious fundamentalism. A movement designed to achieve the creation of a so-called caliphate. This was one terrorist group with a clear territorial ambition. Because in the previous class I had explained that terror groups don't usually have territorial ambition, right? It's insurgents who usually have territorial goals. They want to topple the state and capture power. But ISIS is an exception. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who started leading a radical armed outfit in Iraq, Syria region, clearly said that there is a territorial objective. They want to capture territory, throw out the foreign troops, and establish this caliphate to fulfill their religious fundamentalist agenda. So this movement, terrorist movement that began here in the midst of Iraq's civil war, was entirely rooted in religious fundamentalism, right-wing extremism. So while this was happening in Iraq, parallelly, a civil war broke out in Syria. This again was a result of American intervention. In 2010-11, a pro-democracy revolutionary movement was spreading across Middle East, North Africa. I had mentioned this in the last weekend when we discussed what is insurrection. If you remember, I explained insurrection and gave an example, and Arab Spring was one of the examples. Because of the Arab Spring movement, many authoritarian leaders had been toppled in Tunisia, in Egypt, and this movement was spreading to other countries. So US realized that there was an opportunity to target the rival countries such as Syria and even Libya. The US wanted to remove the governments in these countries which were hostile to US and American interests. So US, along with few other powers, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, they were all part of this covert war, the secret war. And in Syria, they backed the rebels. The Syrian rebels were supported by these countries. They even misused social media as well. Platforms like Facebook, right, which were largely controlled by the US. US did have a higher degree of control on such social media platforms. Their intelligence agencies sponsored the civil war in Syria. Why? Because they wanted to remove President Bashar al-Assad. They wanted to throw out Bashar al-Assad from power because he's a close ally of Iran. Iran and Syria are close allies. They work together to target Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia, to target enemy countries like Israel and Western countries like US. So these countries were on one side, whereas Iran, Syria were on the other side. So the Arab Spring movement was deliberate into Syria as well. Syria again was a stable country, a flourishing economy actually. See, Bashar al-Assad is also a dictator. There's no denying it. Just like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi of Libya, even Assad was a dictator. Even today, Assad remains in power and he's a dictator. It's not that human rights, fundamental rights are protected under such leaders. But the fact is that at least there was a stable government, maintaining law and order, providing governance, maintaining stability in the region, which is essential to keep extremism away. But because of the intervention of these countries and their secret wars, they backed Syrian rebels to carry out a rebellion against the Syrian government to topple Assad from power. This pushed Syria into a state of civil war, and it again created a power vacuum in the region. So on one side, there was already a power vacuum in Iraq, where religious fundamentalists were thriving. And now, the same environment got created in Syria as well, which is a neighboring country of Iraq. And it's under this power vacuum that Islamic State was formed. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, with his radical followers, capitalized on this opportunity. And believe it or not, the US was working with an Al-Qaeda outfit called Al-Nusra Front. The US was supporting a branch of Al-Qaeda. Al-Nusra Front, it's an Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq and Syria. This terror outfit was being supported by the US and its allies, including Saudi Arabia, Israel. Why would they do this? They were doing it because Al-Nusra Front was supporting the Syrian rebels. Al-Nusra Front was targeting the Syrian government. Now look at the irony of this. In Afghanistan, US is fighting Al-Qaeda in 2011. They were still hunting Osama bin Laden. At the same time, they are sponsoring Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria because it serves their geopolitical agenda. This is how these major powers have used terrorism for their geopolitics. Just to topple the Syrian government and remove the Syrian president, they not only supported the rebels, but they also supported Al-Qaeda factions like Al-Nusra Front. So basically, a fertile ground got created in Iraq and Syria where all radicals, extremists, terrorists could thrive, and there was nobody to keep a check on them. So it was amidst all this chaos in Iraq and Syria that ISIS was established by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. At one point, Baghdadi had received support from US. In 2006, 2007, his radical group was supported by US as part of their covert war in the region. So now, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi broke away from all the geopolitics in the region prioritized religious fundamentalism. His only goal was to create a so-called caliphate and declare himself as the caliph. And this goal was achieved in 2014. There was a big power vacuum in Iraq and Syria, no governments, no authorities to keep them under check. So this radical outfit, which was taking shape, right, it was known by a different name back then, before 2014, it quickly captured territory in Iraq and Syria. They captured such a large territory, it was as large as Great Britain. Such a large territory was captured by this terrorist group under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and in 2014 he announced that the caliphate had been formed and he is the caliph. So this is how ISIS rose to prominence. All right. Now, once ISIS was formed, it started gaining immense popularity amongst radical extremists around the world. Because ISIS and Baghdadi, they had achieved something which was the dream of so many radical extremists around the world. No group had ever managed to capture such a large territory and declare the formation of a caliphate. That is what their fundamental ideology teaches them, right? Under the radical version of Salafism, Wahhabism, which is a misinterpreted version of Islam, these radical extremists, they crave to create a caliphate. That is their eventual goal. So even groups like Al-Qaeda had never created a caliphate. No terror group had ever managed to do this. So when Baghdadi declared that a caliphate had been formed and a large territory had been captured by ISIS and that he is the caliph, the extremists around the world, they saw their dream coming true. This increased the popularity of ISIS, and ISIS leveraged the power of the internet, the power of social media platforms to further spread its ideology around the world. The ISIS became known as a brutal terror organization. As soon as it formed the caliphate, it was known for its brutality. It committed major acts of terrorism, including live assassinations on camera, live beheadings on camera. So as the brutality spread, as it became more and more notorious, it became all the more popular amongst extremists around the world, in countries around the world. It spread its propaganda, its ideology very effectively on social media platforms. ISIS members made use of Facebook, WhatsApp, and other encrypted applications like Telegram, WeChat, and many others. These platforms were used by the top leadership of ISIS sitting in Iraq and Syria to spread the agenda around the world. So very quickly, this ideology was consumed by extremists in several countries. And now I think you can guess the impact. The impact was that we started witnessing the rise of self-radicalized terrorists. This was the new model of terrorism created by ISIS. Why am I calling it the new model of terrorism? Because this was unheard of. If you look at traditional terror groups like Al-Qaeda, at that point, Al-Qaeda was seen as the most popular terror group in the world, the most infamous, right? Especially after 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda became a household name. Al-Qaeda had a lot of support amongst these global extremists, right? It was getting a lot of donations. It was getting a lot of support from around the world. And Al-Qaeda was operating in a very traditional, conventional manner. Meaning Al-Qaeda never really leveraged the power of the internet as much as ISIS did. Even Al-Qaeda had an online presence, but it was never effective in spreading the ideology because Al-Qaeda never formed the caliphate. Right? Osama bin Laden could never declare himself as a caliph. So compared to ISIS, Al-Qaeda was a very traditional organization. If Al-Qaeda had to plan an attack, the top Al-Qaeda leaders had to move around from Afghanistan, from the affected areas. They had to move around the world to radicalize people, to get new recruits, to arrange the logistics, to raise funds, to access weapons, explosives, plan the attack, execute the attack. For all this, for all these purposes, Al-Qaeda was functioning as a traditional terrorist outfit. Is that clear? So until 2014, the popularity and dominance of Al-Qaeda was not challenged by any other group. But now suddenly there was this new organization called ISIS, which had created a caliphate actually on the ground, captured territory. The leader had declared himself as a caliph, and they were actively supporting, spreading, promoting their ideology through internet. Basically, this was a new disruptive model of terrorism. It was like a franchisee model. Is that clear? It had created a template and spreading this on the internet, asking people to get self-indoctrinated. So ISIS terrorists never had to move out of Iraq and Syria. They just had to shoot some videos and promote the ideology on the internet, spread it on social media, and extremists around the world, they will consume this, they will get self-indoctrinated, self-radicalized, and they would create ISIS branches everywhere. The power of ISIS ideology and their strategy was so impactful that terrorists from around the world, they subscribed to ISIS ideology. They even traveled to Iraq and Syria to join the caliphate and fight for the caliphate. That was its impact. But Al-Qaeda had to do this very traditionally. Like Al-Qaeda leaders had to move around, raise all the support, the funds needed, the logistics needed, plan attacks in a traditional way, right? It was more like a centralized organization. But ISIS was like a decentralized organization. There was one central unit in Iraq, Syria, which had captured territory, which was spreading the propaganda. And through this franchisee model, around the world, the extremists were getting self-indoctrinated on their own. Through Telegram groups, WhatsApp channels, Facebook and WeChat and all these platforms, extremists were getting self-indoctrinated from many, many countries around the world. Believe it or not, even from Western countries, even few Christians, they got converted to Islam and adopted these radical ideologies, and they traveled to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS. Several educated youth who are in colleges, universities, who are becoming engineers, doctors, they went and joined ISIS. That was the reach, the power of ISIS ideology and how it leveraged social media. These self-radicalized terrorists would carry out attacks on their own. They wouldn't wait for orders to come from ISIS central leadership. They wouldn't rely on ISIS central leadership for funds or weapons. They would arrange everything on their own and carry out attacks, as we saw in Sri Lanka. How NTJ carried out the attack, the Easter Sunday bombing. ISIS had nothing to do with it directly. It had only spread the ideology. Few Sri Lankan terrorists had formed this group, and they carried out the attack on their own and gave credit to ISIS. This is something Al-Qaeda had never managed to do. So this, in a way, triggered a competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That's why many security experts, they compared this with industrial competition, because they look at terrorism as an industry. Because remember what I told you in the last class, any conflict, any war, it's about business, it's about the money. Al-Qaeda's sources of funding was traditional. It relied heavily on donations, funds, etc. But ISIS, which had captured oil-rich territory, did not need any such donations or funds. It had captured the precious oil fields of Iraq and Syria. It was selling the oil in the black market. At its peak, ISIS was earning millions of dollars every day. It was such a well-funded organization. Plus, its ideology was very well received by extremists. So from countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Maldives, even from India, from Bangladesh, from US, from European countries, from across Africa, from all these regions, people were getting self-indoctrinated, they were getting misled, and they were willing to risk their lives to fight for the caliphate. Hundreds of terrorists moved to Iraq and Syria to join the Islamic State. Those who couldn't travel, they formed their own local branches. They would plan and carry out their own attacks and then give credit to Islamic State. So this is how ISIS became a global threat. So obviously, India was also affected. ISIS did pose a threat to India. First, it kidnapped several Indians in Iraq and Syria, especially Indian nurses, Indian workers. They were kidnapped and held in custody. They were held hostage by ISIS. Got it? So India had to work very hard to secure their release. So this is how Indian community abroad was threatened by this terrorist outfit. I'm sure you would have seen various movies, web series, which have been made based on this story, where ISIS captured Indian nurses, Indian workers, held them hostage for months together. Apart from this, ISIS propaganda reached Indian social media. A few Indian youth, they got misled and indoctrinated by ISIS ideology. They got self-radicalized on their own just by receiving videos and radical literature from these social media groups and channels. So in several parts of India, in Kerala, in parts of Karnataka, Maharashtra, in parts of UP, even Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, etc., several local modules of ISIS came up. Initially, some of the youth who were indoctrinated, they tried traveling to Iraq and Syria, and some of them succeeded. And believe it or not, some of them were students. Some of them were engineers, doctors. Some of them took their whole families to Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan to fight for ISIS and its branch, the ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, operating in Afghanistan. Is that clear? It calls itself ISIS Khorasan province. It's known as ISIS-K, ISK, or ISIS-KP. These are different names given to it. It mainly operates in Afghanistan. So many Indians traveled to Afghanistan as well to fight for ISIS Khorasan. Many Indians traveled to Iraq and Syria as well to join ISIS. These were self-radicalized, self-indoctrinated youth. Got it? So these self-indoctrinated youth, they would spend their own money. They would book tickets to some West Asian country, right? They wouldn't tell anyone. They wouldn't tell their family members and friends. They would make a group, and this group of self-radicalized youth, they would book tickets to West Asia, travel to some West Asian country, saying they've got a job, they're going for studies, etc. From there, they would go to Turkey, right? Because Turkey shares borders with this region, the Syria-Iraq region. And from there, they would cross over into Iraq and Syria to enter the caliphate, right? They would get the directions on social media channels, like where to travel, where to reach. But they would sponsor themselves. They would put their own money. There was one terrorist who took his own family, including his wife and children, to Afghanistan, right? And these elements started fighting for ISIS. Some of them got killed. Some Indians have been killed in Iraq and Syria and in Afghanistan. And some of them have returned after the caliphate was destroyed, right? Right now, the caliphate doesn't exist anymore. ISIS has been cornered into one small region. I'll come to that point. But as ISIS collapsed, Many of these Indians who had turned to terrorism, who had joined ISIS, they came back and they were arrested in India. So this posed a serious challenge for Indian authorities. Initially, from 2014 to 2017, India was a little lenient because these were misled youth, self-radicalized youth. They hadn't violated the law, they hadn't exactly taken up an act of terrorism against India, right? They had been indoctrinated, they just wanted to travel to join the caliphate. So that itself is not enough to completely prosecute them. Of course, we can invoke certain laws and punish them, but India didn't want to take that approach initially. Because in India, ISIS never had popular support. Please understand this. Even today, ISIS has no popular support. Majority of Indian Muslims are moderate. They reject this ideology. They know it is a misinterpreted version of religion. It is a few elements who are indoctrinated. So initially, the Modi government wanted to adopt a more moderate approach. So what we did was we monitored social media platforms. We increased our surveillance, our intelligence agencies. They stepped up surveillance on social media to look out for self-radicalized youth. We kept a close watch on social media platforms. So IB, RAW, NTRO, and the state police, they all collectively work together to watch social media platforms to identify these self-radicalized youth who are trying to travel. And once detecting them, we would intercept these radicalized youth and we would prevent them from traveling. They wouldn't be arrested initially because India didn't want to be very harsh. We didn't want any kind of negative blowback against the state because these were just radicalized youth who were looking to travel. They weren't involved in any acts of terrorism as such, right? They hadn't waged war against India. So this lenient approach was taken in order to pull them back into the mainstream, to de-radicalize them. So the authorities would intercept them, prevent them from traveling, and they would counsel them. They would bring professional counselors. They would bring the community leaders, the clerics, and the family members as well, trying to de-radicalize these young radicalized members, hoping that they'll come back into mainstream and resume their normal life. So India made an attempt to pull the youth away from the terror ideology and the radical ideology. But later, some of the elements, they became dangerous, as in they were involved in acts of terrorism abroad. They had fought for ISIS in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, and some were returning back. And we saw the rise of ISIS modules in different parts of the country, which were involved in planning attacks across India. This is where the threat increased for India. The ISIS terrorists who had returned after involving in acts of terrorism abroad, and the local modules which were taking shape, which were executing plans to carry out attacks in India. This became a concern. This is where India became more stringent. So the intelligence agencies with NIA, IB, RAW, NIA, with the state police, they have been effectively neutralizing several ISIS modules in the last few years. You would have read in newspapers, even recently, just a few weeks ago, ISIS modules in Delhi, UP were broken up by NIA. There were ISIS modules detected in Maharashtra and Gujarat, ISIS modules in Karnataka, in Kerala. So all these modules have been broken up. Their plans to carry out attacks in India have been prevented by our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies. So this fight against ISIS continues, and we collaborate closely with our foreign partners because US and many other countries, they keep a close watch on this outfit. We work closely with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries, and with US as well, where we share intelligence and we are jointly working together to defeat ISIS. Understood? So this is the threat the group has posed to India, but fortunately, ISIS has not carried out any attack in India. It has not succeeded in executing a major attack in India. But some modules have planned attacks, they have tried to carry out attacks, but we have disrupted them. Now, coming to the last point here, what is the current status of ISIS? So, as ISIS became a global threat in 2014, a major operation was launched in 2016 by a couple of global powers to target ISIS. By 2016, ISIS was clearly a global threat because I don't know if you remember or if you know about this. Self-radicalized ISIS terrorists had carried out major attacks in US and Europe. Some of them were small groups of self-radicalized terrorists. They had self-indoctrinated themselves, aligned with ISIS ideology. They entered Europe as refugees. They misused the refugee route, sneaked into Europe as refugees, asking asylum, and later they executed major attacks in Europe, in Paris, in London, Berlin, right, in Belgium, in Netherlands. Across Western Europe, multiple ISIS attacks took place. All right. Similarly, in US, there were few incidents. Apart from small groups of ISIS modules, there were single terrorists operating on their own. We call them lone wolf terrorists. They operate like a lone wolf, meaning it's just one individual, right? Just one loner who's just hooked onto the internet, who's always seen this radical literature, material, videos, and self-indoctrinated himself or herself. So these guys have emerged as the new challenge. Because when a big group is involved in planning an attack, they will leave a lot of evidence behind, which is tracked by our intelligence agencies, right? But if a single person is involved, how do you keep track of them? It becomes almost impossible to prevent lone wolf attacks. Because these lone wolf terrorists, they don't even need advanced weapons to carry out an attack. We have seen in Europe and in US and in other countries as well, where the terrorists have just used knives and basic weapons and sometimes trucks, buses and cars to commit acts of terrorism. They take a truck or a bus, drive it into a crowded place, try to kill as many people as possible. They just take a knife and try to stab as many people as possible, right? Or they use basic weapons which are available in other countries like assault rifles and guns, and they go on a shooting spree trying to kill as many people as possible. So how do you prevent these lone wolf terrorists? That has become a major challenge for intelligence agencies. Because if a large organization and a large group is involved, right, if they're planning something, they will leave some evidence behind, some digital evidence, some financial transaction, which gets picked up by intelligence agencies which are monitoring them. So there are chances that these attacks can be prevented. But if it's only one single terrorist who has gotten radicalized at home, sitting at home, and tomorrow they decide to come out and carry out an attack, it's almost impossible to prevent them. So lone wolf terrorism emerged as a challenge because of ISIS. So as the threat increased from ISIS for Western countries, targeted operations were launched in Iraq and Syria to dismantle the group. So who carried out this operation? Of course, one was United States. The US launched major military operations backed with covert intelligence operations. This was led by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the US, with the usage of special forces. They conducted targeted ground operations. They would eliminate ISIS terrorists through targeted special forces operations. They used drones for targeted strikes. So US played a major role in dismantling the ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Can you guess which is the other country which played a critical role in dismantling ISIS? Any idea? Do you know which other country played a crucial role in dismantling ISIS? Very good. Rutika has given the right answer. And Nikhil also has mentioned a related point. It was Russia with the help of Iran. They played a critical role in dismantling ISIS. On one side, US was targeting the group mainly through ground operations through its intelligence agency and special forces and conducting drone strikes. Correct? Parallelly, Russia got involved with support from Iran. Why? Because ISIS was a threat to the very survival of the Syrian government. ISIS is a Sunni radical group. Iran and Syria are Shia countries. ISIS was threatening the Assad government in Syria. And Syria is a very close ally of Iran and a very close ally of Russia. Russia has military bases in Syria. Russia has a major air base and a naval base, which allows Russia to exercise influence in the Mediterranean Sea. So it was critical for Russia to protect the Assad government in Syria. It was critical for Iran to defeat ISIS because these are Shia powers and they felt threatened by the Sunni radical group. So Russia launched major military operations, primarily airstrikes. Russian Air Force, along with the Russian Navy, they launched major airstrikes in Syria and Iraq to dismantle ISIS network with direct help from Iran. Iran's IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a paramilitary force of Iran, also an intelligence agency of Iran, was directly involved in these operations, helping the Syrian government and Russian forces to lead these operations. Russia even deployed its private mercenary group. Recently, it became popular in Africa and Ukraine, which is the Wagner Group. It was founded by an individual who is very close to Russian President Putin. Recently, he rebelled against Putin himself and eventually he got killed. Right? This is related to Ukraine war. But even before that, this private mercenary army raised by Russia was involved in military operations in this region. The Wagner Group, it's a private mercenary or army backed by the Russian state, Russian intelligence and Russian armed forces. So Wagner Group mercenaries were deployed along with Russian armed forces with help of Iran to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So it was this combined effort of US and Russia which led to the defeat of ISIS. And by 2018-2019, the so-called caliphate was destroyed. It does not exist anymore. Today, ISIS has been cornered into a small region along the Turkey-Syria-Iraq border. Along the Turkey-Syria-Iraq border, only in few pockets ISIS has a presence. In places like Idlib and Erbil, these are some places here present in the Turkey-Syria-Iraq region. This is where ISIS terrorists have been cornered. Baghdadi was killed by the US. The leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was assassinated. The US killed him in a drone strike. And the next leader, even he was killed by US drone strikes. So it has almost become like a leaderless organization, and these targeted operations have decimated the group. But please understand, US and Russia were not coordinating these operations. They weren't working together. They were acting parallelly. They were trying to protect their own interests. US wanted to limit ISIS as it was a threat to all Western countries. It was a threat to the whole stability of the region. So US was conducting its own parallel operations with help from the Kurd groups. The Kurds are an ethnic group found here in this region, in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran region. These Kurd armed groups, they're mainly fighting against Turkey for independence. They want to form Kurdistan. So US worked with the Kurd organizations, and with their support and with other allies, they targeted ISIS. Of course, Saudi Arabia, Israel, European countries, they were also involved on the American side. Parallelly, Russia, Iran, Syria, they led their own operations for their own reasons, and they targeted ISIS as well. It was this effort from both the sides that defeated the ISIS, and today they are cornered into just few pockets in Iraq and Syria. So even though ISIS is destroyed, the caliphate is destroyed, the ideology is still very prevalent. That is the power of ideology. The ideology remains very strong on social media. It still propagates on social media. Physically, the group might have been defeated. Caliphate has been destroyed. There are only few ISIS elements left. But still, the ideology remains strong, and local modules can come up anywhere at any time in the world. Be it India, be it in other countries. Local ISIS modules can take shape anytime because the ideology is still popular and very strong on social media platforms. Got it? So that is why it's important to target these groups, and it requires global efforts, coordinated efforts. So this is what you should understand about Islamic State. You can get a full question here. UPSC has already asked some questions, but you can still anticipate questions related to ISIS, its ideology, its rise, the threat it posed to India and the world, and how it has been countered. Next, you already know about Al-Nusra Front. I explained that it's a Al-Qaeda branch which was operating in Iraq and Syria. All right. Then have you heard of Boko Haram? Can you tell me in the comments? Do you know where does it operate? Any idea? What is Boko Haram? Which country does it operate? Nikhil says Niger. Okay, you're partly correct. Rutika has given the right answer. Nigeria. In the African country of Nigeria, and also in the neighboring countries of Niger and Chad. This is where Boko Haram has a presence. You might have read news articles that a terrorist group has kidnapped school-going girls, or a terrorist group in Africa has attacked schools. That group is nothing but Boko Haram. It's a notorious terrorist organization operating mainly in Nigeria. It also has influence in Niger and Chad, and it's aligned with Al-Qaeda's ideology. Later, it aligned with Islamic State ideology. These small terror groups, they have this habit. They pledge allegiance to the most powerful and most influential terrorist group. Previously, it was Al-Qaeda, which was seen as a guide for all these small terror groups. Later, it became ISIS. So that is the radical ideology and agenda of these groups. They mainly oppose girl education, right? They want strict, rigid Sharia to be implemented, right? Which is completely outdated. It's a misinterpreted version of Islam, and it prevents girls from getting educated. That's why they attack schools, they kidnap school-going girls. That's how it became notorious, but it remains active here in Africa and remains a threat. Next, have you heard of Al-Shabaab? Has anyone heard about Al-Shabaab? Any idea in which country does it operate? Very good. Rutika and Nikhil have given the right answer. Even Himanshu has given the right answer. Very good. It mainly operates in Somalia, in the East African country that's in the Horn of Africa region. You have this country called Somalia, which is going through a civil war since 1990s. The Somalian government has almost been removed, toppled, and this radical terrorist group called Al-Shabaab has taken control. It is aligned with Al-Qaeda's ideology, and it is this terrorist outfit that supports Somalian piracy in the Indian Ocean. I'm sure you would have heard about Somalian pirates who attack ships, who take ships hostage in Gulf of Aden near Horn of Africa. right? These Somalian pirates are working for Al-Shabaab. This is one way of raising funds for their terrorist activities. They hijack ships, commercial ships, and extract a ransom from the owners of the ship or from the country to which the ship and the sailors belong to. This ransom is what feeds Al-Shabaab, which is a notorious, dangerous terrorist outfit in Somalia. In fact, I have an interesting point to add. East Africa is very badly affected by jihadist terror groups. Just like North Africa and Sahel region, which is affected by terrorism, similarly, East Africa is also very badly affected. It's not just Somalia. Even in Kenya, in Tanzania, then have you heard about Mozambique? In all these East African countries, Islamic terrorism is a major threat. There are several jihadist outfits having a presence here. In fact, Al-Qaeda has been very influential in Kenya and Tanzania. Back in 1990s, in late 90s, before the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda carried out its first biggest attack against US here in Kenya and Tanzania. Remember, I gave you one more example in Yemen, where Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, which is Al-Qaeda branch in Yemen, had attacked a US naval ship in 1999. This was before 9/11 attacks. Before that, Al-Qaeda's branch in East Africa, which had influence in Kenya and Tanzania, had carried out a major strike against the US embassies. The US embassy in Nairobi in Kenya, US embassy in Tanzania at Dar es Salaam. These embassies were targeted with a major attack, killing hundreds of people, including American diplomats. So this part of East Africa is also badly affected by terrorism. Recently, just few years ago, in Mozambique, a local branch of ISIS was formed and they took over an entire town in Mozambique. They captured a coastal town entirely, which faces the Indian Ocean. That is why I'm mentioning these points. Some of you might be thinking, why is this needed for our exam? It is relevant because we have major interests in East Africa. Do you know that there is a very big Indian community in these countries? Since colonial times, lot of Indian merchants, traders, financiers have settled in Kenya and Tanzania. Gujarati money lenders and financiers, workers from Kerala, Tamil Nadu, they are present, they are settled permanently here in Kenya and Tanzania, even in Mozambique. Indian Ocean region is of great interest for India. If there is a terror group aligned with Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, capturing an entire coastal town, right? This is direct concern for India. We have very important interests in the Indian Ocean, security interests in the Indian Ocean. So terrorism in East Africa is something we closely monitor. India's RAW keeps a close watch on developments in East Africa. It's crucial for us, right? We have important economic interests, cultural interests, and strategic interests. So this is another bothersome region for us because ISIS especially, right? It posed a very big threat a few years ago. They had captured a whole coastal city. Finally, it was liberated. The security forces, they fought and they threw out the ISIS terrorists. So this remains a concern for India. Then finally, coming to the Palestinian outfits, Hamas and Hezbollah. I still remember a few months ago, or let's say last year or before that, many students wouldn't have even heard about Hamas. For them, it was new. But now I'm sure everybody knows about Hamas. It's become a household name. Because what they did on 7th October, it's almost comparable to what Al-Qaeda did in 2001. If 9/11 attacks made Al-Qaeda a household name, the 7th October attack against Israel made Hamas a global name. Hamas operates in Gaza Strip. It became the administrative authority as well in Gaza Strip. And this extremist group is funded by Iran, Syria, and even Qatar is involved in funding Hamas. It basically seeks the liberation of Palestine. See, it is a fact that Israel violated Palestinian rights by never allowing Palestine to be formed as a country. Israel captured Palestinian territory, it violated the two-state solution, right? That's an entirely different issue altogether. But related to it, Palestinians have been fighting for independence. We have seen the struggle develop over decades. But some Palestinians have taken up radicalism and terrorism to achieve that goal. Hamas is one such outfit. Now, this is where the definition of terrorism becomes very difficult, very subjective. Some countries label Hamas as a terrorist group. Same with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is another radical group operating in Lebanon that targets Israel. It targets Israeli American interests, just like Hamas. All right. So US, Israel, and some European countries, they have declared Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist organizations. But many other countries have not recognized Hamas and Hezbollah as a terror group, even India. We criticized the attack. We called it a terror attack. But however, India has not officially labeled Hamas as a terrorist group. Please understand this. Don't be driven by political ideology or the news that you see on social media. I know there is a big polarized debate on religious lines ever since the Gaza war began. India has taken a very balanced position. We constantly support the Palestinian right to have their own country. This was our policy in 1947. Even today, it is our policy to ensure that Palestine becomes a country. Right? We condemn Israel whenever it uses excessive force, when it kills Palestinian civilians. Fighting terrorism is necessary, but you can't fight terrorism by killing civilians. You can't make that an excuse. So India has taken this balanced approach where we support Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism. We called the 7th October attack as an act of terrorism, but we haven't called Hamas as a terrorist group. In fact, we have never called any Palestinian armed group as a terrorist group. Why? Because India knows the complicated issue. We understand the complexity behind it. And we don't want to take such positions which will alienate us with the other countries. We want to balance our ties with Israel while balancing our ties with the Arab countries. So even today, we officially do not call Hamas as a terrorist organization. Same with Hezbollah, right? So it is a problematic, controversial area, but please understand that India's position is that we don't officially recognize them as terrorist outfits. They're fighting for Palestinian liberation. The methods they have employed is highly questionable. They resort to large-scale violence, extreme violence against Israel. Israel retaliates against these groups. Fighting terrorism is fine, right? It's a right of every country to fight terrorism. But in the name of fighting terrorism, you can't target civilians. You can't target entire areas like West Bank and Gaza Strip and commit large-scale atrocities. So this is where India opposes Israel. That's why we haven't supported Israel and its actions in Gaza Strip. We even voted against Israel in recent votes as well at the UN. 24,000 plus Palestinians have been killed, and you cannot justify that at any cost. So this is a more complex issue. I'll give you more idea about this when we discuss this in international relations. Right? Under IR, I'm sure some of you would have attended the classes as well. There we discuss Israel-Palestine conflict. There we get into the details of the issue, right? It's not about judging who's right or wrong. The world is not right or wrong, or it's not a good and bad world. It's something in between. There is a gray area in between. It's not a binary world we live in. It's not just zeros and ones or black and white. It's a gray area. There is a middle path. There are wrongdoings committed by both the sides. Both sides have some genuine issues, genuine demands. So India understands those complexities, and we take this balanced position. We support Israel's right to act against terrorism, to defend itself against terrorism, but we don't support Israel's use of mindless force, disproportionate force against civilians. At the same time, we criticize resort to violence by any Palestinian outfit, but we don't call any Palestinian group as a terrorist organization. This is the fine balance India has struck, and it's better you follow the same in your exams. Don't go to the extent of calling Hamas a terror group, because India itself officially has not called Hamas as a terror group. If you don't believe me, go to MHA's website, look at the UAPA list. You will not find Hamas, you will not find Hezbollah. All other groups are listed, from Lashkar to Al-Qaeda to Islamic State, but Palestinian outfits are not listed. Why? We haven't designated them. We haven't officially called them as terrorist organizations. So please be careful on such sensitive issues, because that might show your bias. You shouldn't have a religious political bias on these matters. What Hamas did was brutal. You have to condemn it. No sane person can justify what Hamas did. It killed 1,300 innocent Israelis. At the same time, no sane person can support Israel, which is killing 24,000 Palestinian civilians. Right? Both are extremes. That is why India takes the balanced approach. Got it? So don't fall for propaganda that you see on social media. Don't be WhatsApp university students. You are IAS aspirants. You are expected to develop a nuanced understanding of these complex issues. Right? Then coming to my last point. Some new issue has developed between Pakistan and Iran, and related to the ongoing Gaza war. There is another radical group which is in the news called Houthis or the Houthis. These are the last 2 points, and I will close the chapter after this. Who are the Houthis or the Houthis? They are a rebel group operating in Yemen. They are sponsored by Iran as part of its rivalry with Saudi Arabia. All right? As Saudi Arabia sponsored the civil war in Syria, along with US and Israel, they tried to topple President Assad, who's a friend of Iran. Iran retaliated against Saudi Arabia by destabilizing its neighbor, Yemen. Yemen was a Saudi ally and a neighboring country of Saudi Arabia. So Iran backed the Houthi or Houthi rebels to topple the Yemeni government, and more than half of Yemen is controlled by this rebel group. Until now, it was not a global threat. It was just limited to Yemen and the region around it. But recently, it has escalated its ability to carry out attacks in the region. A few years ago, the Houthis had fired drones and missiles into Saudi Arabia and UAE. They had attacked oil refineries, which disrupted the oil markets. They attacked a few cities as well. And one Indian was also killed in this attack. This was not an attack against India per se. It was an attack against Saudi and UAE, which are Sunni powers, which are opposed by Houthis. Iran uses them as a proxy to target them. So in this attack a few years ago, an Indian got killed in Saudi Arabia, because there are a lot of Indian workers in Saudi and UAE. Right? So it has targeted oil refineries and cities in Saudi Arabia and UAE, and one Indian had been killed previously. But now, after the Gaza war, after Israel targeted Gaza, right, and it launched this war against Hamas and started killing Palestinians, the Houthis have declared support to Hamas. They have declared support to Palestinians, and they have launched attacks against ships in the Red Sea, and they have extended this into Arabian Sea. So this is where the concern comes up, not just for India, but the whole world, because Red Sea is a critical shipping lane, vital for connecting Europe with Indian Ocean, a major trade route for Asia and Europe to connect the Western and Eastern hemispheres. This critical route has been threatened by Houthis, who have fired drones and missiles at ships. Initially, they targeted only Israeli ships owned by Israeli companies or heading towards Israel or coming from Israel were targeted. But later, every ship is being targeted. And they attacked one ship which was coming to India. It was carrying oil from Saudi Arabia coming to Mangalore in Karnataka. And very close to our EEZ, they launched an attack. And this is where it becomes a direct concern for India. So India is closely watching these events. Indian Navy has been proactively deployed in this region. And currently, we are undertaking a mission to stabilize these waters. If necessary, India will not hesitate to target the Houthi attacks which are coming against commercial ships. Just like we have targeted the Somalian pirates who threaten shipping, if Houthis are threatening commercial shipping and targeting ships headed towards India, this is a direct concern for us. Because this is a critical shipping route. All our exports, imports are passing through this Red Sea route. We cannot have this situation because this increases the economic cost of transportation. Ships are avoiding the shorter route. They are taking a longer route across Africa, across the Cape of Good Hope, moving around South Africa and reaching Indian Ocean. This has doubled the shipping time. The cost increases. Insurance premium will go up. And this will lead to rise in commodity prices. This will destabilize the global economy itself. So India is keeping a close watch. Multiple naval ships are deployed along with our drones and aircrafts to deal with the threat. And if necessary, if there is a threat, India will not hesitate to target Houthis if necessary. That is the situation that has developed right now. All right. Then something else, something related has happened in Pakistan and Iran. What is it? Iran launched military strikes into Balochistan, which is Pakistan's territory. This is Iran's retaliation against American, Israeli interests and Saudi interests. It's again an outcome of the Gaza war. First, it launched attacks in Iraq and Syria. It fired drones and missiles into Iraq and Syria, targeting alleged Israeli-American spy bases. Iran said that CIA and Mossad are running intelligence operations targeting Iran and fired these missiles and drones. Within a day, it fired multiple missiles and drones into Pakistan, right? Hitting the terror camp of a terror group called Jaish al-Adl. This is a Baloch terror group. It is based out of Pakistan, supported by Pakistan, but it carries out attacks against Iran. It wants to liberate the Sistan Balochistan province of Iran. All right. See, the Baloch people, they are found in Iran and Pakistan. The Baloch area extends on both sides. You have the Balochistan province in Pakistan and Sistan Balochistan in Iran. So there is a Baloch group called Jaish al-Adl, sheltered by Pakistan. It has support in Balochistan region. From here, it attacks Iran. Its goal is to liberate Sistan Balochistan. Right? It attacks Iranian security forces, police officers. It has killed multiple Iranian security forces. Iran believes that this group is supported by Pakistan on the behalf of Saudi Arabia. It's believed that Saudi Arabia is backing Jaish al-Adl via Pakistan, and Pakistan is sheltering and supporting the group. So as part of Iran's attacks against Israeli-American interests, it has launched this attack into Pakistan because this group is sponsored, supported by Saudi in Pakistan. And Pakistan retaliated as well. Obviously, it was an act of war. Pakistan's sovereignty had been breached. Pakistan has attacked a few Baloch groups that are sheltered by Iran, that have some support in Iran. There is the Baloch Liberation Army and the Baloch Liberation Front. These are Baloch nationalist groups fighting for Baloch independence. They mainly attack Pakistan. They target the Pakistani state. They are fighting for their independence for many years. Pakistan even alleges that India supports them as well. It's an allegation by Pakistan. We deny it. We do have contacts with Baloch groups, right? Any country would have such contacts, but we don't support them, at least officially, publicly, as we know, we don't support these outfits. Pakistan has alleged we give funds and weapons as well. This is just an allegation which India has denied. But Pakistan's current problem is with Iran. Iran has sheltered these Baloch groups that attack Pakistan. They want to liberate Balochistan from Pakistan. So Pakistan retaliated against Iran by launching airstrikes against these Baloch camps present in Iran. And this has escalated the situation. Now kindly pay attention to all these developments. Please don't think I'm just wasting time discussing a lot of topics. Trust me, all these are very essential for your exams. It might seem like a small subject, but there are so many details, so many developments happening that it becomes relevant for the exam and you are expected to know about it. So this completes my detailed discussion of terrorism. I've covered every possible topic that is needed. This is more than sufficient. Now all you have to do is be up to date with current affairs. Follow current affairs regularly. There will be a lot of updates regarding these topics, and take up previous questions. Look at previous questions which have been asked. Try writing answers to them. I want you to go through the questions later. It's all based on what we have studied, what we have discussed, right? There are questions on ISIS, surgical strikes, on terrorism being a competitive industry. I discussed the competition between ISIS, Al-Qaeda, right? So all such latest topics have entered as questions in GS paper 3. So kindly go through this. You can expect questions on terror funding, Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, global nature of terrorism, support from OGWs for terror groups, how we deal with them. OGWs are nothing but overground workers who provide direct or indirect support to terrorists. They are called OGWs, overground workers. There could be some locals giving funds to terrorists. There might be some locals who are sheltering terrorists in their houses, storing weapons and explosives for terrorists, or helping them in a terror attack. Right? They might help in the planning, in carrying out surveillance, or they might, provide a car or a bike which is used by the terrorists to carry out an attack. Such logistical support, which is being given by locals, right? We call those locals as OGWs, overground workers. India has banned many organizations as well in J&K, which are involved in such overground activity. Meaning they are normal people having normal lives, but behind the scenes, secretly, they're supporting terrorists and giving some support to them, directly or indirectly. So we deal with these OGWs as well. If they are involved in acts of terrorism, we treat them like terrorists. But if they are only providing some nominal support, if they have been threatened and forced to support them, then we deal with it slightly differently. Instead of strictly acting against them, we monitor them, we warn them, we advise them not to work with them, right? We try to pull them away from terrorist influence. But those who get involved in terror attacks, those who provide any kind of direct support, they will be targeted by Indian forces and they'll be treated according to the law. For example, there was one local who arranged the SUV which was used by the suicide bomber in Pulwama attacks. India got hold of this individual and he was prosecuted as a terrorist. This is an overground worker who played a direct role in procuring this vehicle which was used in the terror attack. So such elements, such locals who are directly backing terror attacks, they will be treated as terrorists themselves. UAPA covers such logistical support as well, right? They can be prosecuted under the anti-terror laws. So they are arrested, punished according to the law. But those who are just giving nominal support, those who are ideologically inclined, helping in their propaganda, or those who are being threatened and forced by the terrorists to support them, they are pulled away. They are slowly, counseled to move away from terrorist influence, and we don't act strictly against them because we don't want to turn the local population against the Indian forces. So that is how India deals with OGWs. We grade the OGWs into different categories. The Indian Army in J&K, it grades the OGWs into different categories. Grade 1 OGWs are the serious ones. the ones who are directly backing and getting involved in acts of terrorism. So we treat them just like terrorists. Those who fall under category 2, category 3, they are treated slightly, more leniently. Those who fall under category 2, they are given more strict punishment. They might be given a jail term, right? A little lesser than grade 1 OGWs. Those who are under grade 3, right? They are given a more lenient treatment. The focus is on pulling them away from the influence and ensuring that they don't support any such terror groups. So some organizations have been banned by India. India has labeled them as overground organizations. They will be acting like media outlets or NGOs, but behind the scenes, they'll be supporting terror groups. So many such groups have been banned by India, and that is essentially the policy that India has followed when it comes to dealing with overground workers. You can't target all OGWs because some of them may not be involved in terror attacks. Some of them might be forced and threatened to help the terrorists. So only the category 1 OGWs who are directly involved in terror attacks are punished very strictly. They are treated just like terrorists. But those who are under grade 2, grade 3, they are given a slightly different treatment under the law. All right. Those who are under grade 2 will be punished, but with a lesser jail term. Those who are under grade 3 are usually not arrested. They are advised to not work with them, help them. They are advised to move away from their influence. So that is the graded approach we have for dealing with OGWs in Kashmir. So please go through these questions, prepare answers. You can keep some answers ready as well for few topics, right? It's a big chapter and you can expect related questions. There can be a terror-related question in polity, a question on, let's say, UAPA, a question on NIA in polity, a IR question in paper 2, which is connected to internal security, right? Or an essay topic. So please be ready for such questions. Don't assume that questions will come only in internal security. Related questions can come in the other subjects as well, because this is such a topic that it is connected with many other subjects. So I hope you have understood everything. Now, give me a few minutes. I'll go through your questions. I'll answer all the doubts. And after that, we'll take a break. We'll take a 30 minutes break. Break will be from 4 to 4:30. 4 to 4:30, we'll take a break. You can refresh yourselves, have some food as well. But we have 10 minutes, which is enough for me to look at all your doubts and questions. Please go ahead, ask any doubt, any question that you have. Ghulam Mustafa says, sir, these events show the impact of international events on internal security. Yes, you're absolutely correct. Global developments, they have an impact on our domestic security. Like, for example, the Gaza war, the attacks that Houthis are carrying out. That's the best example to show how global events can impact our security as well. Rise of ISIS is another example. Sir, please give lunch break. Yes, we are taking the break from 4 to 4:30. I know it's a little late. Usually we take it from 3:30 to 4. But since we were at the end, I wanted to finish the topic. Now we can go for a break. We'll come back at 4:30. Avani is asking, please explain the Kurd group. See, Kurds, Kurds, they are an ethnic group found in the Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria region. There, the Kurd community, they have formed few armed organizations. They're fighting against the government of Turkey. They want to establish Kurdistan. They want to liberate the Kurd areas, mainly from Turkey, and form a country, separate country called Kurdistan. So Turkey is at war with the Kurd groups. All right. The US worked with the Kurd groups to fight against ISIS. The CIA worked with the Kurd organizations, the militant organizations, and gave support to them and took support from them while targeting Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So these are the Kurd armed organizations. Turkey sees them as a threat. Turkey targets these Kurd organizations as they threaten Turkey's integrity and sovereignty. Is that clear? So these groups are fighting for Kurdish independence. They want to form a separate country called Kurdistan. Nikhil says ISIS shows that if nations work together, they can really defeat terrorism. I think that's what Nikhil means to say. Yes, you're absolutely right. If countries apply their mind, if they collaborate, if they work together, the problem of terrorism can be resolved. And I think by now you would have understood terrorism is a problem created by geopolitics. It's not a problem created by religious fundamentalism alone. Religion has been misinterpreted for geopolitics. So if you trace the origin of terrorism, modern day terrorism, you will find that in most cases, there is a geopolitical reason behind it. Like how US played a role, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Pakistan, all these countries, right? They have been involved in some way or the other in backing the rise of terrorism. So if countries get together genuinely, if they collaborate, work together, terrorism can be defeated. Yera is asking, can social media stop these videos which is promoting radicalization? Of course, social media platforms, they have to act. They have taken some measures as well to prevent the spread of terror ideology on their platforms. We will discuss this in the next chapter. After Northeast insurgency, we'll try to finish it today. Tomorrow, we will discuss social media and internet. So there I will explain this in detail. Janvi is asking, sir, do we have class tomorrow? Yes, of course. Tomorrow, the last class, we will have the whole class tomorrow. Diksha is asking, sir, what comes under radical material? See, any text or video which is promoting radical philosophy, extremist philosophy, it could be political radicalism, religious radicalism, that is radical literature. That's what you mean by radical material, right? So let's say Salafism, Wahhabism, which promotes jihadist ideology. So the radical text related to it, which is a misinterpreted version of Islam, any videos related to it, any material, propaganda material used by the terror groups and extremist groups, that is radical material. If you look at Maoism, all the radical communist material related to Maoist doctrine and philosophy, that is radical literature, that is radical material. Ganesh is asking, sir, how to address Hamas in mains? You can refer to Hamas as an extremist group, as a radical group. You don't have to call Hamas a terrorist group because India itself has not labeled Hamas as a terrorist group. Is that clear? That's why I explained the difference between extremism and terrorism. Extremism has a wide range within it, and terrorism is the worst form of extremism. So instead of openly calling Hamas a terrorist group, refer to it as an extremist group. So that way you're safer, you are being diplomatic, and you're taking the stand which is supported by the Indian government. So with your exams, you have to be careful when you write answers. Don't go on labeling every group as a terrorist group, right? So you can always call them as extremist groups. So that way you're balancing the position. Gia is asking, sir, under 1267 sanctions committee, only individuals can be designated as terrorists? Yes. Only individual terrorists can be designated as global terrorists under 1267 sanctions committee. Abhishek is asking, sir, as we have evidence against Pakistan's intelligence agency, whenever terror attacks happen, why don't India try to declare terror groups by UN 1267? See, terror groups can't be declared by UN 1267 sanctions committee. All right, but these terror groups are recognized by most countries, even US, European countries, the United Nations as well. They have recognized Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed as terrorist groups. The individual terrorists are listed, designated by the UN as well under 1267 sanctions committee. But still Pakistan does not act against them. Why? Because for Pakistan, they are assets. Pakistan uses them against India. It's using terrorism as a geopolitical weapon to gain global prominence and to target India. So Pakistan will never give up this weapon, right? Unless and until the army and ISI change their mindset, their approach, that will not happen. So UN has already done it. It has recognized these groups as terrorist groups. The individual terrorists are listed as well because of India's effort and the effort of other countries. But still, Pakistan is not serious about tackling terrorism. Vritika is asking, can you please explain in short the lineage of Al-Qaeda from Taliban and so on? Okay. You understood how Taliban was born from Afghan Mujahideen, right? In the 1980s, Afghan Mujahideen had been supported by US and Pakistan to target the Soviet forces which occupied Afghanistan. From the Afghan Mujahideen, some radical students, they broke out and formed the Taliban. Taliban was a political organization, a radical political organization, and its goal was to capture power in Afghanistan, to form the government, so that they could declare Afghanistan as an Islamic emirate and enforce the Sharia law. This Taliban that took root in late 80s from the Afghan Mujahideen, it was like a byproduct of Afghan Mujahideen. It finally won the civil war. It threw out all the warlords, the competing powers, and captured power in Afghanistan in 1996. So as Taliban formed the government in Afghanistan, it declared Afghanistan as an Islamic emirate, enforced the Sharia, and it gave shelter to terrorist outfits. It gave a call for all the radical terror elements around the world to assemble in Afghanistan, to come to Afghanistan, saying that Taliban government will protect them. Whichever terror group targets Western countries were welcomed by the Taliban, including Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda was this terror group formed by Osama bin Laden in 1990s. Osama bin Laden is a Saudi citizen, was a Saudi citizen. He had founded Al-Qaeda in Sudan, in Africa, right? So he was looking for a base, for a country where he could freely operate and grow his terrorist outfit. So in 96, when Taliban took root and established itself, Al-Qaeda got a permanent base in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden shifted to Afghanistan. The whole top leadership of Al-Qaeda shifted, and they were sheltered by the Taliban leadership. So Taliban was the government. It was a radical political entity involved in violent acts of insurgency and terrorism, and it gave shelter to a terror group, that is Al-Qaeda. All right, so that is the lineage and the connection between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So Taliban was born from Afghan Mujahideen. It was a byproduct of Afghan Mujahideen. It had clear political aims. It captured power and established an Islamic emirate and declared the enforcement of Sharia. It sheltered various terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group that was sheltered in Afghanistan by the Taliban. All right. So guys, let's head towards the break, 30 minutes. Come back at 4:30. We'll start with the next module, very important, Northeast insurgency.